Chapter 242. The Indian cultivators were known as Brahmins. Brahmins were a religious name similar to Buddhism, and they also represented the highest class in Indian society. At the same time, they were an organization similar to the Wu Lian in India. This Indian cultivator, who had only met Qin Shi once and did not even mention his name, was completely reduced to dust by the attack of the divine sword shadow. Then, he fell to every corner of the Siachen glacier with the wind and snow. It was not right to say that it was only one person. In fact, it was two people. Two celestial realm cultivators who were comparable to Sun Wen. This secret technique that could instantly double one's combat power was called Maithuna among the Brahmins, which was also known as dual cultivation. Dual cultivation originated from the Brahmins of India. It was originally a cultivation method, but after it spread to Huaxia, it was misinterpreted and abused by the Tibetan esoteric sect. It completely became a trick to cheat people and lost its value and meaning. After all, dual cultivation was not as simple as rolling in the sheets. First, one had to find a man and a woman who were of equal talent and had the same mind. They had to cultivate according to the secret technique from a young age, so that they could enter a state of harmony and life and death together. The close connection from the soul to the body allowed their combat power to have a superimposed effect. This kind of shameless secret technique was also the main reason why the martial arts world of Huaxia was generally unwilling to provoke the Brahmins. But then again, celestial realm cultivators were rare. Now that a pair had died, it was a very heavy blow to the Indian Brahmins. Once the news spread back to Huaxia, who knew how many people would clap their hands and applaud? Regarding this, Qin Shi didn't have much of a reaction. He silently glanced at the mountain that he had flattened. After confirming that the opponent's aura had completely disappeared, he turned to look in the direction of the convoy. At this moment, a green light flashed. The shadow of the Tian Yen divine sword reappeared beside Qin Shi. After taking a deep look at this old friend that had been with him day and night, Qin Shi gently waved his arm, and the shadow of the divine sword slowly dissipated. This trip could be considered a small gain. Although Qin Shi's understanding of Dharma powers was still too shallow, he had enough cultivation and experience. As long as he was given enough time, he would definitely be able to grasp the true essence of the Dharma idol. He would no longer be able to merely grasp the shape of the Dharma idol. Thinking of this, Qin Shi couldn't help but look up at the dark sky. The real Tian Yen sword might be lying quietly in some corner of the vast universe right now. Iron Egli was leaning against the car window. When he saw Qin Shi's figure appear through the snow, he couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. Because of the limited vision, they had been sitting in the car all this time and did not know what was happening outside. However, everyone could still clearly feel the violent tremor just now. It was as if there was an earthquake, and the car kept shaking. If the all-terrain vehicle was like a tin can, then they were the sardines inside. They could only curl up in the can and pray to God helplessly. In front of nature, human beings were always so insignificant. Iron Egg Li's face was tense. Because he was overly worried about Qin Shi's safety, his eyes were a little red. He had been trying to open the door, but this all-terrain vehicle was a special military bulletproof vehicle. How could he break it with his bare hands? As soon as Qin Shi unlocked the restriction, Iron Egg Li violently opened the door. Because he used too much force, he even lost his balance and almost fell off the car. Iron Egg Li's attention was all on Qin Shi, so he didn't notice that the snow had strangely covered the tracks. Therefore, as soon as he got off the car, he stepped on the thick snow and frantically ran toward Qin Shi. "Mr. Qin. Are you okay?" It wasn't easy to be a guard. In times of crisis, not only did he have to use his hands to block the enemy's blade, he also had to sacrifice his body to block bullets for his superior. If anything happened to Qin Shi, as a guard, he would be held responsible by the army. The honest Iron Egg Li didn't understand the concept of EX level. He always thought that Qin Shi only knew a little martial arts. "I'm fine, don't worry." Seeing this, Qin Shi smiled and patted him on the shoulder, indicating that he didn't have to worry. Iron Egg Li was not good with words. After seeing that Qin Shi was fine, he forced a smile and said, "Mr. Qin, the snow is so heavy, it's very dangerous. If you want to know the situation outside, just let me know. I'm a scout, I specialize in this kind of thing. Okay, I got it. Hearing this, Chin-shi smiled and nodded. While the two of them were talking, the others got out of the car. The people in Chin-shi's car were all normal people. A few of the professors were blown by the cold wind and immediately shivered, so they quickly got back into the car. The people in the other two cars were Wu Lian people, so they didn't have much of a reaction when they got out of the car. Among them, there was a great master in the Kong state named He Tiangang. After he got out of the car, he went directly to Chin-shi, then respectfully bowed to him and said, "Mr. Chen, you've worked hard." Maybe it was because of their trust in Chin-shi, the Wu Lian only sent one person in the Kong state, and the rest were all in the transforming state. He Tiangang was the one with the highest cultivation level among all the people present, other than Chin-shi. Therefore, he could roughly hear some movements. For example, the movement caused by the avalanche, and the roar of the Shiva statue. He Tiangang was a smart person, so he didn't tell everyone what happened outside. When he saw that Chin-shi seemed to have taken care of everything, he immediately ran over to express his gratitude to Chin-shi. Showing his presence in front of an X-level master and flattering him without batting an eyelid was always a good thing. Seeing this, Chin-shi smiled and went back to the car. He Tiangang was still smiling because his cultivation level was low and he didn't understand the specific situation. If he really saw what happened, he probably wouldn't even have the courage to stand in front of Chin-shi. In order to form a glacier, there must be a lot of snow. Therefore, storms were actually very common in the Siachen Glacier. This snowstorm lasted for a long time, and it didn't stop until 3:00 in the afternoon. The convoy obviously couldn't stay here forever, so they set off again in the snow. In this terrible weather, unless the Indian soldiers were made of iron, they wouldn't patrol the mountains. The all-terrain vehicle traveled smoothly through the mountains. After 2 hours of driving, Chin-shi and the others finally arrived at their destination, Siachen Pass. Chapter 243. India's mountain combat troops were the army with the most experience in high-altitude and cold areas in the world. From 1984 until now, the Indians had successfully built at least 150 strongholds here. But seriously, this place was more meaningful than practical. The temperature was -50 degrees, and it was often accompanied by snowstorms and hailstorms that reached 100 kilometers per hour. If it weren't for the appearance of an oasis, Huaxia obviously wouldn't have sent people here to investigate. Perhaps it was because of the weather, Chin-shi and his team didn't encounter any Indian sentries along the way. After the all-terrain vehicle went over a small mountain, everyone suddenly felt that their vision suddenly widened. This was a huge flat terrain zone. The towering icebergs were like a barrier, blocking the wind and snow on the other side of the mountain. If one were to look down from the sky from an airplane, one would find that the terrain of this place was like a gourd. It was composed of 2 oval plains, one big and one small, connected together. The surrounding area was full of rising mountains and precipitous ridges. The waist of the gourd was the so-called Siala Mountain Pass. The motorcade went over the short mountain and came to the mouth of the gourd. Then, they suddenly stopped not far from the mouth of the gourd. Because everyone was shocked by the scene in front of them. People who had never seen a glacier might not be able to imagine what kind of scene it was. The ground was white, the mountains were white, and the sky was white. As far as the eye could see, it was a vast expanse of whiteness. It was an extreme scene of ice and snow. However, in such a pure world of ice and snow, a large oasis appeared out of thin air. First of all, it was unscientific. Secondly, it was unscientific. Finally, it was unscientific. On the side of the Siachen Glacier, snow was everywhere. Although the weather now was much better than in the morning, there was still light snow in the sky. The entire sky was shrouded by dark clouds, and it was a hazy scene. However, inside the mouth of the gourd, there were lush plants and green grass. The dark clouds and snow seemed to be blocked by the towering mountains, so the bright sun shone from the sky and illuminated the entire valley. The driver was a little unsure of the situation. For the sake of insurance, he stopped the car outside the valley. After the four professors in the car saw the scene in front of them, they immediately walked out of the car and carefully observed the surrounding situation. It was still snowing outside the valley, but inside the valley, the sun was shining brightly. From a scientific point of view, this situation could be explained with a convincing explanation. But what was the situation with the plants inside? Not only was it winter, but they were also in the highlands that were more than 6,000 meters above sea level. The climate was comparable to that of the Antarctic. Even if there were plants in such places, they were of the lower order, such as mosses or ferns. The seemingly inconspicuous grass by the roadside was actually a high-grade plant, so it was absolutely impossible for it to appear in such an extremely cold area. Professor He shuddered and hugged his jacket tighter before squatting down to dig at the snow. He wanted to check the temperature of the soil here. However, after digging at least half a meter deep and not seeing any soil, Professor He wisely gave up on this idea. This place was full of pine snow. Even if he continued to dig, he would probably only be able to dig out a glacier that had not melted for 10,000 years. While the professors were studying the differences between the inside and outside of the valley, He Tiangang stealthily led the Wu Lian people into the gourd with Qin Shi's permission. He Tiangang did not see any Indian soldiers along the way, so he assumed the Indians were hiding in the oasis. Therefore, he wanted to sneak in to take a look. However, when He Tiangang stealthily approached the mouth of the gourd, he was shocked to discover that there were no Indian soldiers in the valley. In fact, there were not even any living creatures in the valley. There seemed to be an invisible dividing line at the mouth of the valley. The moment He Tiangang crossed it, the surrounding temperature shot up abruptly. It was as though he had suddenly arrived in Sanya from the northeast. In fact, it was even more exaggerated than that. The temperature difference soared to more than 70 degrees Celsius. The Wu Lian people immediately dispersed and went deeper into the oasis to investigate the situation. At this time, Qin Shi also slowly crossed the dividing line. However, the moment he crossed the dividing line, he couldn't help but take a deep breath. The spirit energy here was so dense. It was comparable to Tian Xian. Was this the phenomenon brought about by the revival of spirit energy? Qin Shi stood at the mouth of the gourd and raised his head slightly to look at the blue sky above the valley. This place was actually a natural spirit gathering formation. Every mountain and even every boulder in the surrounding area occupied the key positions needed to set up the formation. Was all of this man-made, or was it the will of the heavens? Qin Shi frowned slightly. After standing at the mouth of the gourd and sensing for a while, he waved his sleeves and concealed his figure. Then, he suddenly flew into the sky above the valley. He looked down at the entire oasis from the sky. Everything in the oasis was in his eyes. Apart from their group, there was no one else in the huge oasis. Since there were cultivators stopping them from entering the mountain, it meant that India knew about the existence of this place and had sent people to guard it to the death. Then, where were the Indians? Perhaps because the oasis had just appeared, the trees in the valley were not flourishing. Apart from the lush green grass, there were only a few scattered trees and shrubs. When he first saw this valley of green grass, it gave him a breathtaking feeling. However, after looking at it for a long time, this valley gave him a very strange feeling. The sun was shining brightly, the vegetation was lush, and it was as peaceful and warm as a park in the afternoon. However, it gave him a vague feeling that this place was very deserted, and at the same time, very strange. Qin Shi frowned and pondered for a moment. Only then did he realize that it was because there were no sounds of animals or insects in the valley. At the same time, there was no sound of wind. The entire valley was eerily quiet. Qin Shi flew in the sky and quietly observed the actions of everyone below. He Tiangang led a team to carefully inspect the oasis. Several professors were busy moving various instruments out of the all-terrain vehicles. Everything seemed normal. Apart from discovering that this was a natural spirit gathering formation, he did not find anything unusual. However, this was why it seemed a little abnormal. She didn't know why, but Qin Shi always had a feeling that a storm was coming. However, he could not pinpoint exactly what was wrong. This feeling. Qin Shi frowned. After pondering for a while, he suddenly realized that this feeling had already appeared once before. When this feeling first appeared, it was also when he discovered that the earth's spirit chi had begun to recover. That was a normal human reaction to the unknown. That was why he instinctively felt repulsed. Chapter 244. In such a remote area, logistical supplies could only be transported by helicopter. Therefore, even if the Siala Pass was a strategic military area, the number of soldiers stationed around it generally did not exceed a platoon. A platoon had 3 squads, each squad had 10 people. Due to the special nature of the mission and the fact that they did not know how important the oasis was to the Indians, Wu Lian sent masters who were at least masters or above. In addition, he invited Qin Shi, an EX-level celestial, to lead the team. This was already an indication of how important the oasis was. Once they were discovered by the Indian garrison, the martial artists would be able to restrain them while the professors would take the opportunity to collect samples and data. There was no problem with the plan. However, to everyone's surprise, there was not a single person in the oasis. He Tiangang also felt that something was wrong. Therefore, after he confirmed that the oasis was safe, he still ordered everyone to spread out and be on guard to ensure the smooth progress of the mission. He did not dare to relax for even a moment. The other professors did not have as many concerns as He Tiangang. After hearing He Tiangang say that it was safe here, they openly set up tents in the oasis. They then moved all kinds of instruments inside and powered up the all-terrain vehicle. It was as if they had set up a temporary laboratory here. Qin Shi did not find anything strange. After pondering for a while, he decided to just cultivate here. After all, it was a sacred place for cultivation. He could not just let it go to waste. In the blink of an eye, it was 6:00 in the evening. Dinner was very simple. It was Hua Xia Army's individual rations. Just when everyone was taking turns to eat, Qin Shi suddenly found He Tiangang and handed him a stone. The stone was the most common stone, but Qin Shi cast a spell on it. If anything happened, He Tiangang only needed to throw the stone on the ground, and he would know immediately no matter where he was. As for where he was going, was there a need? Of course, he was going home after work. He had been separated from the little guy for a whole day. Qin Shi really missed the cute little guy. Since he did not find anything strange, he did not need to stay here all the time. After all, compared to cultivation, Qin Shi preferred to be with the clingy little guy. He Tiangang was different from the straightforward Li Taidan. He knew Qin Shi's strength very well, so he did not dare to ask too much. Therefore, after taking the stone from Qin Shi, He Tiangang carefully put it in his pocket. Not to mention a stone, even if Qin Shi gave him a pile of shit, He Tiangang would still put it away properly. In order to prevent Li Taidan from worrying, Qin Shi specifically went to greet him before she left, saying that she was going out with He Tiangang for a walk. Only then did Li Taidan feel relieved. Then, Qin Shi flew into the sky. However, before he left, he still glanced at the oasis below with some concern. After confirming that there were no problems, Qin Shi flew back to Rome City without looking back. When Qin Shi returned to Aunt Zhang's house, the family was happily sitting on the sofa and watching cartoons with the little guy. Qin Shi gently knocked on the door. Although the sound was soft, it immediately attracted the little guy's attention. Then, she suddenly bounced up from the sofa as if she had been electrocuted. Before Aunt Zhang could react, the little guy had jumped off the sofa and ran quickly to the door. As she ran, she shouted loudly, "Papa is back! Papa is back!" Qin Shi heard his daughter's sweet voice through the iron door. He could not help but smile. Time seemed to return to the time in Kangju district. At that time, didn't the little guy look forward to him coming home from work every day? Home is a warm harbor, come back to rest when you are tired. It was a simple sentence, but at this time, it resonated deeply with the people in the room. The old-fashioned iron door was quickly opened. The little guy followed her grandmother's instructions and opened the door only a crack. She tilted her little head and looked outside with one eye. After confirming that it was indeed Qin Shi standing outside, she suddenly opened the iron door and rushed directly to Qin Shi. "Papa! Seeing the little guy rushing to him, Chin-shi quickly squatted down and held her in his arms. After kissing the little guy's smooth little face, Chin-shi asked with a smile, "Nyan, do you miss Papa?" Hearing this, the little guy suddenly grinned and said, "Yes. Good girl. Muah." After Chin-shi walked into the house with the little guy in his arms, Aunt Zhang immediately stood up and asked with a smile, "Have you eaten? There are still some dishes. I'll heat them up for you." While speaking, Aunt Zhang was about to go to the kitchen. Seeing this, Chin-shi immediately stopped her and said with a smile, "No, I've eaten outside." "Okay, sit down. I'll get you a glass of water." "I can do it myself, how can that be?" Aunt Zhang smiled and patted Chin-shi's hand away, then went into the kitchen to get him some water. Chin-shi could only smile helplessly since her objection was futile. Auntie Zhang was still treating him as a guest. When Chin-shi sat next to her with the little guy in his arms, Qin Ruoying asked with a little concern, "Are you okay?" "Of course not. You know how powerful your husband is. Look at you." Seeing his relaxed face, Qin Ruoying was relieved and did not ask any more questions. While Chin-shi was talking to her, she placed the little guy between the two of them. Seeing this, the little fellow immediately stretched out her two little hands happily. She held Papa on the left and Mama on the right, and then naughtily pulled them to her side. On the big sofa, the family of three was tightly squeezed together. When Aunt Zhang came out of the kitchen with cold water and saw this scene, she could not help smiling. After waiting for so many years, she finally saw their family reunion. The little thing was curled up between the couple. When it saw its grandmother come out, it immediately stretched out its body and lay on Qin Ruoying's body. It patted the sofa next to it and shouted, "Grandma, come and sit too." "Okay, Grandma, sit down." Aunt Zhang handed the cup to Chin-shi and touched his little head lovingly. Then she sat next to Qin Ruoying. Then the little thing jumped off the sofa. After taking a serious look at each of her relatives in front of her, she introduced them one by one to the air as if she was practicing to introduce her relatives to strangers. "This is my Papa. This is my Mama. This is my Grandma." In fact, this was a child's mentality to show off. Of course, she couldn't help showing off now that she had everything she didn't have before. Her childish and naive behavior amused everyone so much that they couldn't help but shake their heads and burst out laughing. Chapter 245. The whole family happily sat on the sofa and watched cartoons. The little fellow watched TV while holding Chin-shi's mobile phone. Although the cartoons were very interesting, she still looked down at the phone from time to time and then grinned. And the thing that made her so happy was actually just a photo. It was a family photo consisting of her, Papa, Mama, and Grandma. The only thing that made the little fellow feel a little regretful was, the big cat was not in the family photo. Although the little fellow had the twin brothers as good friends, the big cat was her first real companion, so she naturally would not forget the big cat. But unfortunately, the big cat did not come to Chengdu with them. The big cat seemed to retain some of its animal nature, so it was not willing to exercise in winter and stayed at home all day. When they set off from Shangjing, Chin-shi did not force the big cat to accompany them, but very kindly asked if it would like to go back to Chengdu with them to play. The big cat was also a little tempted, but when it heard that it was going to take a plane, it was suddenly scared and jumped to the beam, then shook its head like a rattle drum and decisively refused Chin-shi's proposal. It could be seen how much it hated to take a plane. It was night. After the little fellow fell asleep, Chin-shi gently turned over from her, and then quietly lay side by side with Qin Ruoying. Qin Ruoying also seemed to enjoy this feeling, so for the first time, she did not cultivate tonight. In the dark, the couple's fingers were clasped and their hands were connected, silently feeling each other's existence. At this moment, they were happy. However, at this dull and sweet moment of happiness, Chin-shi suddenly frowned. Because the stone was activated by He Tiangang. Qin Ruoying was now a successful cultivator, so she immediately noticed the abnormality from Chin-shi's hand. So, she quickly turned her head and whispered in the dark, "What's wrong?" "There's a problem." "The thing that second aunt asked you to help with?" Yes. Then go quickly. Be careful. We'll wait for you at home. Alright, don't worry. I'll be back once the matter is settled. Qin first squeezed her hand, then leaned over and gently left a kiss on her lips. Only then did he reluctantly get off the bed. After all, He Tiangang was a great grandmaster in Gang State. It was impossible for him to joke with Qin about this kind of thing. Something must have happened for him to activate the stone that Qin had given him. Thinking of this, Qin couldn't help but quicken his steps. But before he left, he didn't forget to go to the little fellow's side. He bent down and pecked the little fellow's cute little face before he left the house with a frown. As soon as he walked out of the building, Qin soared into the sky and flew directly in the direction of the Karakoram mountain range. The moon was very bright tonight. Perhaps because of the high altitude, the moon in the Karakoram mountain range looked significantly bigger than the moon in Chengdu. The cold moonlight shone on the undulating ice mountains as if it was draped with a thin layer of silver yarn. When Qin crossed the Karakoram mountain range and arrived at the Siachen Glacier, he saw that the Siachen mountain pass seemed to be completely covered by a mass of dark clouds from afar. The dark clouds were very thick, like a lid, covering the entire Siachen mountain pass so tightly that he couldn't see the situation below at all. Seeing this, Qin couldn't help but frown slightly. This scene was a bit strange no matter how he looked at it. But looking at the fluctuation of spiritual energy in the surroundings, it didn't seem to be caused by humans. This was a bit strange. Qin flew above the dark clouds. After looking down for a while, he suddenly snapped his fingers. Then, a ball of light suddenly jumped out of his fingertip. The light ball was very weak at first, but it emitted a faint glow. But as Qin threw the light ball downwards, the light ball became brighter and brighter. Finally, the light ball was like a magnesium lamp, bursting with extremely dazzling light. The light ball quickly floated above the dark clouds. The dark clouds themselves were colorless. Many people thought the dark clouds were black because the water vapor in them was too heavy, which greatly affected the light. In addition, the clouds were too thick and completely blocked the light, so people thought the dark clouds were black. After the light ball went into the dark clouds, the light suddenly became a bit hazy. It was like driving on the highway in a fog. Even if the lights were on, one could only see a few meters away. The clouds were very thick. As the light ball went deeper and deeper, it finally completely lost its light. Qin flew in the sky and watched the light ball gradually being swallowed by the dark clouds. He couldn't help but let out a cold snort, then plunged into the dark clouds. He wanted to see what was going on inside. Qin was very fast. In the blink of an eye, he reached the ground. But when he reached the ground, he realized that the entire Siala Pass was filled with dark clouds. The visibility was less than 1 meter. It was clouds in the sky, but on the ground, it could only be called fog. The thick fog covered everything. At the same time, the oasis was just like during the day. There was no sound around. Silence, eerie. If Qin was a normal person, he would probably faint from the scene in front of him. After all, who knew if a ghost face would suddenly appear in the thick fog, or if an arm would reach out? Qin snapped his fingers again. This time, 4 light balls appeared at the same time. The 4 light balls burst out with a strong light, which immediately pushed the visibility of the surroundings to more than 5 meters. At this time, Qin saw the temporary laboratory that the professors built during the day. There was no one in the laboratory. The indicators of the various instruments were not lit up. It seemed like there was no electricity at all. 3 all-terrain vehicles were parked next to the laboratory, and there was no one in the vehicles. A total of more than 20 people just disappeared into thin air. It seemed like Qin was bored of this exploration game, and he suddenly let out an angry snort. Then, the Sky Spill Godly sword appeared next to him. Qin held the long sword in his hand and slashed at the thick fog in front of him. A crescent-shaped sword aura suddenly burst out, and it created a strong wind that directly slashed at the thick fog in front of him. Since the fog was blocking his vision, he had to clear the fog first. However, What Chen-Shi didn't expect was that after the crescent-shaped sword aura flew for more than 10 meters, it suddenly disappeared into the thick fog. Seeing this, the expression on Chen-Shi's face suddenly became slightly more serious. The sword aura he released was swallowed by the thick fog? The thick fog swallowed his sword aura? Are you kidding? Chapter 246. The fog was like the souls of the dead from the 9 serenities. It was as if it wanted to devour everything. Chen-Shi's crescent-shaped sword aura only flew for about 10 meters before it completely lost its glow in the thick fog. Although it was just a casual swing of his sword and was not an exquisite move, it should not have been so weak. This situation really shocked Chen-Shi and caused him to instantly get into battle mode. But what was out of Chen-Shi's expectations was that he waited in the thick fog for quite a while but did not discover any danger lurking in the fog. Everything was very calm. It was as if it was just a natural fog. Chen-Shi held the Tian Yen sword in his hand and frowned as he constantly observed the thick fog in front of him. His divine sense was sealed, so he could only rely on his 5 senses to observe the outside world. The fog was so thick that it could not be seen through or blown away. Even if there were light balls in all directions, Chen-Shi could only see within 10 meters at most. This feeling really made him very unhappy. Chen-Shi stood in the thick fog for a long time. After a long while, he seemed to have thought of something and a thoughtful expression suddenly appeared on his face. Thus, he stretched out his arm and opened his palm. A miniature spirit-gathering formation immediately appeared in Chen-Shi's palm. Following the activation of the spirit-gathering array, a faint cyclone rose from his palm shakily. The spirit-gathering formation was the most basic formation and its working principle was very simple. After it was successfully set up, it would be like a tornado and constantly revolve around the eye of the formation to absorb the surrounding spiritual energy. Thus, when the spirit-gathering formation appeared, the cyclone condensed and formed at a speed visible to the naked eye. Its color also became darker and darker until it finally became an extremely thick milky white. In less than a minute, Chen-Shi suddenly felt a cold feeling in his palm. Upon closer inspection, it turned out that a drop of water had suddenly condensed in the center of the cyclone. Seeing this, Chen-Shi's expression suddenly became one of realization. He finally understood what this thick fog was. Just like how water can be divided into gaseous, liquid, and solid forms, the spiritual chi of heaven and earth can also be divided into several forms. Under normal circumstances, mortals were unable to see the heaven and earth spirit chi. However, if the spiritual chi of heaven and earth was too dense, it would become as hazy as fog. This form of spiritual chi of heaven and earth was also called spiritual fog by immortal cultivators. The mist was in a liquid state, but it was made up of extremely fine water droplets, which was why it could float in the air. In addition, when the spiritual chi of heaven and earth reached a certain level, it would completely change from a gaseous state to a liquid state, which was the so-called spiritual liquid. Spirit liquid was extremely rare. Chen-Shi had only seen it a few times in Heavenly Spiral. As for the solid spiritual chi of heaven and earth, which was the legendary spiritual crystal, he had only heard of it but never seen it before. It completely existed in legends. The reason why Chen-Shi didn't immediately recognize that it was a spiritual mist was because the spiritual energy of heaven and earth in this form had already become a whole. Just like a balloon filled with water, every drop of the spiritual mist contained surging spiritual chi of heaven and earth. This spiritual chi would not leak out, so only by piercing the balloon could one feel the energy contained within. It turned out that the entire sky above this huge oasis was actually filled with spiritual mist. This was a little interesting. Chen-Shi withdrew the celestial sword Dharma idol and then activated the technique. At that moment, his entire body seemed to have turned into a human-shaped black hole, and he began to madly devour the spiritual mist around him. However, now was obviously not the time to cultivate, so he could only devour the spiritual mist as he silently walked into the depths of the oasis. At that moment, a thought suddenly appeared in Chen-Shi's mind. The mysterious village hidden in the depths of the Qinling Mountains, after hundreds of years of accumulation by the Great Spirit Binding Array, only caused a spiritual chi tide that lasted less than 15 minutes. The spiritual chi tide successfully opened a crack in the sky, and created the existence of the heavenly generals, who were completely beyond the current realm on earth. If the elders waited until the spiritual chi revival to open the array, would they be able to directly open the divine gate? Thinking of this, Qin could not help but raise his eyebrows. He could not help but be curious about what was behind the divine gate. What level of existence would the heavenly generals be considered in the divine gate? Qin's thoughts drifted further and further away. At this moment, something that suddenly appeared in front of him pulled him back from his thoughts abruptly. A tree appeared in front of Qin. A huge tree. Because the visibility was too low, Qin could only walk around the tree. This turn was incredible. The diameter of this tree was more than 20 meters, which meant that the circumference of this tree was at least 70 to 80 meters. If he remembered correctly, this place during the day, other than the green grass, there were only some trees and shrub seedlings. Only a few hours had passed. How could such a huge tree appear out of nowhere? How could Qin not be surprised? Although Qin could also make the green mountains bloom with red makeup and make the thousands of maple leaves bloom with magic. However, he definitely could not make a seedling turn into a 1,000-year-old ancient tree in an instant. The diameter of this tree was more than 20 meters, and he did not know how tall this tree was. Qin stood under the tree and looked up, but the thick spirit fog completely blocked his vision, so he could not see the situation above the tree trunk at all. Seeing this, Qin thought about it and took a step forward, wanting to touch the bark of this tree. However, the moment his palm touched the tree bark, something unexpected happened. A formless energy suddenly surged in from all directions like a hurricane, formless but extraordinarily powerful. Qin's reaction was also very fast. The Tianyan sword appeared in his hand almost instantly, followed by a clang sound. He originally thought that there was an enemy attack, but when Qin turned around with the sword in his hand, he realized that there was a new change in the spirit fog behind him. Just like how Moses parted the sea in the legends, the spiritual fog that was so thick that even he couldn't disperse seemed to be pushed to the sides by two invisible glass walls, so much so that a passage appeared in front of him out of thin air. The passage was pitch black. Seeing this, Qin immediately flicked his finger. A ball of light suddenly flew into the depths of the dark passage. The passage was not very long, and the ball of light quickly flew to the end. At this time, Qin also saw the thing at the end of the passage. It was a huge stone tablet. It was not right to call it a stone tablet, because this stone tablet was shining brightly under the light of the ball of light, constantly reflecting the unique luster of metal. The stone tablet was very big, at least 10 meters tall and 2 to 3 meters wide. On the surface of the tablet, there was a line of ancient characters, which read, Chapter 247. Qin looked at the stone tablet at the end of the tunnel, then turned back to look at the giant tree behind him. At this moment, he could not help but shake his head and laugh. Spiritual chi revival, heaven and earth phenomenon. This was getting more and more interesting. Perhaps it was because of his boldness, Qin did not think too much. He held the Tianyan sword and walked into the tunnel that suddenly appeared. Just like the spiritual fog that filled the sky, the tree and the stone tablet were strange existences that suddenly appeared tonight. Thus, everything in front of him was either an illusion or a large-scale formation. With Qin's current cultivation, an illusion that could affect his mind would at least require a cultivator of the insightful emptiness realm to cast. But what kind of existence was the insightful emptiness realm? With Earth's current conditions, it was obviously impossible to give birth to a cultivator of the divine transformation realm. After eliminating the illusion, there was only one possibility left. This was a large-scale formation that stole the fortune of heaven and earth. A large-scale formation that used the spiritual fog as the foundation, the tree as the formation door, and the stone tablet as the formation core. When the spiritual fog appeared, the formation would be activated. Because Qin touched the tree, he was pulled into the formation. There were many uses for formations, but looking at the current situation, the formation in front of him should not be a support formation like the spirit gathering formation. It was very likely to be a killing formation. A formation whose main purpose was to kill. Since he was already in the formation, he had to find the formation core if he wanted to break the formation. Chen-shi quickly came to the side of the stone tablet. After carefully looking at the stone tablet, he realized that other than the words, "Exorcise evil and seal demons," on the front, the back of the stone tablet also had the words, "Human desires, Heaven's wrath prison." Seeing this, Chen-shi held the Tian Yen sword and gently slashed at the stone tablet. As expected. When the tip of the sword touched the stone tablet, it was like a stone falling into a calm water surface. The place where the tip of the sword touched actually had a slight ripple. This huge stone tablet was actually an illusion that was similar to a mirage. Since the stone tablet was just an illusion, Chen-shi didn't want to stay any longer. He picked up his sword and walked towards the back of the stone tablet. As if he was strolling in his own backyard, Chen-shi leisurely strolled through the thick fog. There was originally a thick fog behind the stone tablet, but as Chen-shi continued to go deeper, the fog in front of him became thinner and thinner. In the end, a faint light shone out from the fog. When Chen-shi finally walked out of the fog, in an instant, golden light filled the sky. Just like the rising sun, thousands of golden rays of light shot from the front and shone directly on Chen-shi's body. Chen-shi looked forward against the golden light and realized that he was in a strange place. This was a huge square, but it was not empty at all. Instead, it was piled with countless treasures. Just like in The Hobbit, where the dragon Smaug occupied the lonely mountain treasury, countless gold, silver, and jewels were randomly piled up in the square. It was a dazzling array. It was so dazzling that it almost blinded people's eyes. It was estimated that the current gold and silver reserves in the world couldn't form such a huge scale. If such a treasury was discovered by outsiders, who knew what kind of uproar it would cause? In the 18th century, California in the United States was originally a very remote and backward place. However, after the news of the discovery of gold in California spread, the entire United States and even the world was shocked. Thousands of gold miners flocked to California. The population boom led to the emergence of several international metropolises in California, such as Hollywood and Los Angeles. As a result, California went from a small and remote place to one of the top administrative regions in the United States. From this, it could be seen how tempting gold, silver, and jewels were to humans. If the news of the treasury was leaked, Hua Xia would probably start a war with the Indians tomorrow. Ordinary people scrambled for gold, silver, and jewels, but to Chen-shi, this treasury was obviously not as valuable as a drop of spirit fog. Therefore, even if there was a mountain of gold and a sea of silver in front of him, he didn't even look at it. He stood at the entrance and looked around. The treasury was very quiet. There was no one and no strange movements. Other than the countless gold, silver, and jewels, there was only a winding stone path in this huge square. The stone path crossed the entire square, and at the end was a large expanse of thick fog. Seeing this, Chen-shi didn't delay any longer and walked directly into the depths of the square along the path. Both sides of the path were piled with priceless gold, silver, and jewels. He only needed to bend down slightly and Chen-shi could pick up a palm-sized gold brick from the ground. However, he still didn't look at it and walked on the path without looking sideways. Soon, Chen-shi came to the end of the path. The thick fog engulfed him again. The moment Chen-shi walked into the fog, the square suddenly changed. The countless mountains of gold and silver suddenly turned into a scalp-numbing sea of corpses and blood. How was this a treasury? It was simply hell. Countless corpses were piled up randomly. The mountains of gold became mountains of limbs, and the sea of silver became lakes of blood. If one looked closely, one could see many soldiers wearing Indian military uniforms. It was no wonder that when Chen-shi and his group arrived at the oasis, they didn't see a single Indian soldier. They must have been wiped out in this strange place. Chen-shi continued to walk in the thick fog. By the time the fog had thinned out and the light had returned, he had arrived at a new place. It was a new square. However, the square was no longer piled with gold, silver, and jewels. Instead, it was filled with countless large icicles that looked like clusters of crystals. Similarly, there was still a stone path winding through the square. Chen-shi continued to walk along the path. When he passed by the icicles, he suddenly realized that there was a woman sealed in each icicle. Countless devastatingly beautiful women were all stark naked without a stitch of clothing on. Although these women were sealed in the icicles, their expressions and postures were extremely seductive and lustful. Just looking at them a few more times could make one's heart burn with lust. With Chen-Shi's appearance, the women in the icicles seemed to have come alive. They lay in the icicles and kept changing all kinds of seductive postures. They even faintly let out a series of extremely erotic moans. For a moment, the square was filled with erotic scenes. Such a scene made Chen-Shi frown uncontrollably. He now had a rough idea of what this formation was all about. The formation in front of him was different from traditional killing formations. Although it was also offensive, it wouldn't take the initiative to attack. Instead, it would set up all kinds of traps to lure people into it. Once the person who entered the formation couldn't resist and touched the traps, death would await them. However, with this level of temptation, let alone immortal cultivators, even martial artists with slightly higher cultivation wouldn't be able to tempt them. It was too easy. Therefore, Chen-Shi didn't stop at all. He directly passed through the square and entered the fog again. As he continued to move forward, Chen-Shi's frown deepened. He really didn't understand now, no matter what, this was a large-scale formation that used spirit fog as its base. Was this all it could do? Chapter 248. Chen-Shi walked through the fog. When the fog in front of him thinned again, he came to the third square. Slightly different from the previous two squares, the third square was covered with lush vegetation. As soon as he stepped into it, he felt as if he was in a primitive forest. However, there were no signs of any living creatures in this primitive forest. Although he was not close to the square, a strong herbal fragrance went straight to the tip of Chen-Shi's nose. As far as the eye could see, this place was simply like a paradise. Money and beautiful women, is it time for spiritual herbs and rare treasures? Chen-Shi thoughtfully glanced at the rare fruits, lingji, and immortal herbs on the square, but her feet still didn't stop for a moment. He seemed to be strolling slowly, but in fact, he used the means of shrinking the ground. In a few steps, he crossed the entire square and then disappeared into the thick fog again. Among the 5 elements, metal, wood, and water had appeared. If nothing unexpected happened, the next should be the fire array or the earth array. As expected. When Chen-Shi came to the 4th square, he suddenly felt a wave of heat hit him in the face. Countless huge copper pillars were erected in the huge square. Below the pillars, a raging fire was burning. It looked somewhat similar to the tortures of the ancient times. If the metal array and the water array were only targeted at ordinary people, then the wood and fire arrays had begun to target cultivators. Especially the fire array. When Chen-Shi stepped into the fire array, the heat in the air faintly raised an inexplicable irritation in his heart. At this time, Chen-Shi found that this array was not as simple as it looked on the surface. In fact, if this array had not been affecting the mind of the person who entered the array, there were probably not many muddle-headed people who would easily touch the trap in such a strange place. After all, how could gold, silver, jewels, and beautiful women be more important than their own lives? The stranger the environment, the more cautious people should be. Chen-Shi thought silently as he walked through the fire array and into the thick fog again. There was only one earth array left. However, when the fog in front of him thinned again, what appeared in front of Chen-Shi was no longer the square, but a very familiar place. His and Yingying's home. Zhonghai, Kangju District. Although Chen-Shi had lived in the Sai courtyard for a period of time, the home that he truly recognized in his heart was still this slightly shabby demolition community. Looking at the familiar scene before him, even Chen-Shi couldn't help but be stunned. The furnishings in the room were the same as before. Old furniture, picture albums scattered all over the place, and everything else. It was all so real. Just as Chen-Shi was lost in thought, a clear and melodious papa came from behind him. Papa. Chen-Shi looked back and saw Nyanyan standing behind him. She was holding a picture book and seemed to want to hand it to him. Papa, tell a story. Nyanyan raised her small hand with great effort, as if she wanted to stuff the album into Chen-Shi's hands. Chen Shi lowered his head and looked at Nyan cute smiling face and expectant eyes. At this moment, he was strangely enraged. Because he was so angry, it even caused the veins on his forehead to bulge. A dragon has a reverse scale, and a wolf has a thorn. Kill if you look at it, kill if you touch it. This array dared to touch the softest part of his heart and tried to conjure a little girl to deceive him. Damn it. Kill, kill, kill. In a fit of rage, Chen Shi slapped the picture book in Nyan's hand. Then, he let out a roar and said, "Sword, come." He hadn't been so angry in a long time. Daring to have ideas about Nyan, kill without mercy. Chen Shi suddenly stretched out his right hand and made a grabbing motion in the air. But that familiar feeling didn't appear. Because the sword didn't come. The sky-spilled divine sword didn't appear. Chen Shi couldn't help but look at his right hand in surprise. Then, he activated the spell and tried to use his true essence to condense the divine sword Dharma again. But at this moment, a familiar voice suddenly sounded. Chen Shi. What are you doing? Are you crazy? You're scaring her. With a shout, Qin Ruoying, who was wearing an apron, rushed out of the kitchen and hugged Nyan in a panic. She comforted her in a low voice. Nyan was obviously frightened by Chen Shi's reaction. After Qin Ruoying hugged her, she suddenly pouted her little mouth and cried out loud. Wah! Nyan, don't cry. Mommy is here, don't cry, don't cry. Qin Ruoying squatted on the ground and hugged Nyan tightly in her arms. While comforting the child, she raised her head and glared fiercely at Chen Shi. Then, she shouted angrily, "Are you crazy? Look clearly. She is Nyan. She is your daughter." Qin Ruoying roared at Chen Shi, then she seemed to think of something. She couldn't help muttering in a panic, "No, your illness is getting worse and worse. Nyan, Dad is sick again. Let's go get the medicine for Dad." Hearing this, Nyan seemed to be frightened. After looking back at Chen Shi with red eyes, Nyan sniffed and tried to stop crying. Looking at his wife and daughter in panic, Chen Shi couldn't help but let out a low roar, "Fuck." This array formation had actually affected his mind. Chen Shi originally came in with the mentality of playing, but he didn't expect that even he would be lost in this array. Thinking of this, Chen Shi couldn't help but show a dignified expression on his face. Then, he suddenly put his palms together and made a gesture with a solemn expression. 49 Styles of Tianyu, Spell Section, 10th Manifestation, Break Illusion. It specializes in breaking all illusions and illusions in the world. However, at this moment, Chen Shi seemed to have completely lost his cultivation, and there was no trace of true spirit surging all over his body. He tried to use break illusion, but everything was still the same. And Qin Ruoying, after seeing Chen Shi's behavior, seemed to be frightened by something. He picked up Nyan, then rushed into the bedroom. Looking at Qin Ruoying's frightened look, Chen Shi's brows were frowning more and more. Break illusion failed. It seemed that his consciousness had been completely lost in this array. He thought that this was just a simple killing array, but he didn't expect it to be a composite array of killing, illusion, trapping, and disturbance. His current situation was somewhat similar to the state of his soul leaving his body. His physical body was still in place, but his consciousness was trapped in the illusion built by the array. Therefore, in this situation, he couldn't be anxious, and could only slowly think of a way to break the array. Illusion arrays could also kill people, and the principle was similar to the triple dream realm in the inception space, causing the consciousness of the person who entered the array to be trapped in the illusion and never be able to wake up. To break the illusion, it wasn't easy, but it was actually very simple. It was easy, but it was actually very difficult. This was because it had nothing to do with cultivation, it was all about one's willpower. Don't forget your original intention. These 4 words were the divine weapon to break all illusions in the world. Thinking of this, Chen Shi immediately sat cross-legged, held his breath, and tried to find a way to wake himself up. And not long after he sat cross-legged. Chapter 249. Qin Ruoying took out a few pills and tried to stuff them into Chen Shi's mouth. This was haloperidol, a very common antipsychotic drug. It was mainly used to fight hallucinations and delusions. It had a certain sedative effect, and at the same time, it was also toxic. Chen-shi sat cross-legged in the living room like a stone Buddha. No matter how Qin Ruoying tried to persuade him, he had no intention of opening his mouth. Nian was lying in the corridor outside the bedroom. She tilted her head and only revealed a pair of eyes. She silently looked at her parents in the living room. Perhaps it was because he had just cried, but the little guy's eyes were red, giving him a pitiful look. Nian and Yingying, these were the two most important people in Chen-shi's life. At the same time, they were also Chen-shi's weakness. In the Tianxian world, most cultivators were far more afraid of illusion arrays than killing arrays. Once one entered a killing array, there was only a slim chance of survival. Although illusion arrays did not kill people, they were more frightening than killing arrays. This was because illusion arrays could make people lose themselves and willingly sink into the beautiful illusion carefully woven by illusion arrays. Until the person's physical body died and their soul dissipated, there was no way to wake up. Zhuangzhou dreaming of a butterfly? Or a butterfly dreaming of Zhuangzhou? Look at me, I'm Yingying. Be obedient, okay? Take the medicine obediently, okay? Look at Nian, you scared her. Don't be like this, okay? We were very worried about you. Qin Ruoying's slightly worried voice kept ringing in Chen-shi's ears. But Chen-shi sat on the ground motionlessly, as if he did not hear anything. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying's face couldn't help but darken. Bean-sized tears suddenly gushed out from her eyes. Life will always experience twists and turns. If the company closes down, then so be it. Don't give yourself so much pressure, be strong. No matter what you do, I will support you, but don't give up like this, okay? I'm so scared, Qin Ruoying kept talking in Chen-shi's ear. Chen-shi did not have the ability to seal his hearing. Therefore, no matter how hard he tried to enter a meditative state, Qin Ruoying's words still drilled into his ears without missing a single word. From Qin Ruoying's words, Chen-shi also passively understood his current situation. After he graduated from university, he started a family with Qin Ruoying. Later on, he had Nian. As the family expenses increased, he left the company to start his own business. Dreams were always beautiful. Because of his lack of experience, the company went bankrupt. Chen-shi was also deeply affected by this and even suffered from depression. In the following days, Chen-shi didn't work anymore. Instead, he stayed at home every day. His condition also became more and more serious. At first, it was just insomnia. Later on, he actually developed schizophrenia. From time to time, he would go crazy like today and fantasize that he was a god more powerful than Superman. It was not the first time that Qin Ruoying saw Chen-shi behave like this. Therefore, she hugged Chen-shi tightly and kept whispering in his ear. Chen-shi was unwilling to open his mouth, so Qin Ruoying kept trying to open Chen-shi's mouth and feed him the pill. There was no doubt that this kind of care came from the heart. However, Chen-shi was completely unmoved. He was always looking for a way to wake himself up. Only people who experienced the horror of the illusion array knew. Every cultivator who came out of the illusion array alive was a person with a firm mind. If even he began to doubt himself, he would only sink deeper and deeper into the illusion. Once Chen-shi showed a trace of wavering and began to think about whether everything in front of him was real or not, it actually meant that he had already fallen. Don't forget your original intention. Remember. Everything in front of him was illusory. No matter what he saw or heard, it was all fake. In fact, there was a simple and crude way to break the illusion array. That was, kill Qin Ruoying in front of him. Since the illusion array confused him with his wife and daughter, the key to breaking the array was obviously Qin Ruoying and Nian. Unfortunately, even if Chen-shi knew that it was an illusion, he was not willing to hurt Yingying and Nian in the illusion. This was probably the difference between him and many cultivators. No matter what Qin Ruoying said, Chen-shi was unmoved. After a long time, Chen-shi finally entered the state of meditative anatta. At this time, Qin Ruoying, who was next to him, suddenly showed a trace of fear on her face. She began to shake Qin Shi and cried, "Shi? Are you leaving us? Don't go. Don't go, please. Papa. Papa. Don't leave me behind. I don't want you to go." Nian also ran out of the bedroom. The mother and daughter squeezed next to him, crying and begging him to stay. At this moment, Qin Shi was like a scumbag who abandoned his wife and daughter. He completely ignored his wife and daughter's cries. As his five senses became more and more blurred, Qin Ruoying and Nian's voices also became farther and farther away from him. The next moment, Qin Shi suddenly opened his eyes and found that he was sitting cross-legged in an empty square. There was nothing above the square, even the small path was gone. There was a thick fog in all directions. The illusion array was finally broken. Qin Shi sighed softly. With a grab, the heavenly derivation sword appeared in his hand. The familiar feeling came back again. Qin Shi stood up, but the expression on his face was still very serious. This array, it was really scary. Qin Shi frowned and seriously looked at the illusion around him. The current him did not dare to underestimate this array anymore. Just as Qin Shi was observing his surroundings, a crisp sound of a slap suddenly rang out from behind him. Slap, slap, slap. No more, no less, just 3 slaps. Qin Shi looked back. When he saw the face of the person, Qin Shi was suddenly stunned. Because a person who absolutely could not appear here had now appeared in front of Qin Shi. This was a woman. A woman described in the Luo Shen Fu like a light cloud covering the moon, floating like the returning snow in the wind. Looking from afar, like the sun rising in the morning. Looking closely, like a lotus blooming out of the water. The woman was wearing a blue dress and her hair was tied up in a cloud bun, but she did not wear any makeup or jewelry. Her eyebrows were dark, like the distant mountains in the fog. Her eyes were blurred, like the warm spring river. That incomparably exquisite oval face was faintly tinged with pink, which was extremely alluring. Ying stood up, as if she wanted to steal the bright light of heaven and earth. The woman walked out of the fog and walked towards Qin Shi. Seeing this, Qin Shi suddenly closed his eyes. When he opened his eyes again, the woman was even closer to him. When the woman was about 2 meters away from Qin Shi, she finally stopped. At this moment, Qin Shi called out her name with a complicated expression. Zijin. The person who came was Goddess Zijin. Chapter 250. Sky Yen Divine Sect. Yu Zijin. Someone who should not have appeared in front of Qin Shi had suddenly appeared in front of him. Yu Zijin had a faint smile on her face. But if one looked closely, there seemed to be a hint of playfulness hidden in that smile. After sizing up Qin Shi, Yu Zijin said softly, "Qin Shi, long time no see." Long time no see. Suddenly seeing an old acquaintance here made Qin Shi a little confused. After replying dryly, Qin Shi did not know what to say. After a long while, he then asked with a complicated expression, "Zijin? Why are you here?" Hearing this, Yu Zijin looked at him deeply, then asked, "Why don't you make a guess?" Qin Shi did not reply immediately. Because his feelings were very complicated. Take a guess. These 2 words were what he used to say to Yu Zijin. Heavenly Spiral did not have as rich a cultural and entertainment life as Earth, so when he was free, Qin Shi would hum a few pop songs for Yu Zijin. And every time Yu Zijin asked where he learned it from, Qin Shi would always reply with the words "take a guess." But, wasn't the teleportation array destroyed? How did Zijin come to Earth? Qin Shi frowned as he tried to think of an answer. Yu Zijin was not in a hurry, and just looked at him with a smile, as if she wanted him to come up with an answer himself. If he really had to make an analogy, Qin Shi's current feelings were like when he was out shopping and suddenly saw a good friend who had died many years ago. That kind of feeling really made people feel a little complicated. If he had to use a word to describe the relationship between Qin Shi and Yu Zijin, then the word beauty was naturally the most appropriate. Beauty. It was known as the 4th type of relationship, dissociating from family, friendship, and love. It was the highest level of interaction between friends of the opposite sex, and also the most dangerous stage. This type of relationship was more dangerous, and if one was not careful, they would cross the red line. The result was either a lifetime or a stranger. After hundreds of years together, it would be a lie to say that they had no feelings for each other. Fortunately, the obsession in Chen Shi's heart did not disappear with the passage of time. Qin Ruoying was the other half of his life that he was searching for. Therefore, even though Chen Shi had lived in heavenly spiral for 500 years, when he found out that there was still hope for him to return, he resolutely chose to leave. He wanted to leave the world that didn't belong to him. From then on, they would never meet again, not knowing each other's strengths and weaknesses. Just like Shi Murong's poem, Farewell, described it, I quietly retired. Forgive me for not saying goodbye. And in the deepest, deepest corner. Trying to hide you. He could hide it from anyone and for any period of time. It was an unreachable distance. Chen Shi's heart was in a mess. He hadn't felt this way for a long time. He had always been very clear about Yu Zijin's feelings for him. So when he faced Yu Zijin, Chen Shi's feelings were always a little complicated. He didn't do anything wrong, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt. He felt as if he owed someone something. Chen Shi was slightly dazed. Yu Zijin didn't disturb him. She just stood in front of him, silently sizing him up. Chen Shi wanted to open her mouth a few times, but after seeing her familiar eyes, she couldn't help but swallow the greeting that was already on the tip of her tongue. That gaze was very similar to the past. Meeting Yu Zijin was too sudden, so much so that Chen Shi's mind went blank. At this moment it was as if he had returned to heavenly spiral in the middle of the night, standing in front of goddess Zijin, who had once fought side by side with him. Chen Shi was all too familiar with this scene. Midnight dream? Wait, something didn't seem right. Chen Shi was suddenly stunned. Then, he suddenly raised his eyebrows, and his confused eyes immediately became clear and sharp. This was an illusion. He didn't break the array. Instead, he fell into a deeper layer of illusion. This array had found the deepest crack in his heart, layer by layer. First, it was Qin Ruoying and Ninian, who wanted to use his family to restrain him. When he thought that he had succeeded in breaking the formation and relaxed a little, he would then conjure up Yu Zijin and use that to destroy his psychological defenses. No wonder Yu Zijin's reaction was a little strange. That was because although the illusory formation had found the gap in his heart, it was unable to understand more. That was why Yu Zijin was like a wooden person, and could only passively receive the information from him and then respond to him with it. Scary, it was really scary. This array was really too strange. It could even dig out the deepest secret in his heart. Perhaps it was because she sensed Chen Shi's strange behavior. At this moment, Yu Zijin suddenly laughed. Her face revealed a smile as pure as a young girl's. She asked mischievously, "Why? You can't guess? Do you want me to tell you?" "I can tell you, but you have to beg me." "If you beg me, I'll tell you." The current her was very similar to the past. However, Chen Shi only looked at her expressionlessly. At this moment, his heart was as still as water. The next moment, Chen Shi, however, raised the Tian Yen sword in her hand and directly pierced her chest. "You?" Yu Zijin lowered her head and looked at the long sword in Chen Shi's hand. She was in disbelief. In an instant, shock, pain, anger, and grief flashed across her face. "Chen Shi, why did you?" Yu Zijin seemed to want to say something, but Chen Shi calmly pressed the long sword in his hand forward. The long sword pierced through Yu Zijin's body. At this time, Chen Shi took a step forward and whispered in her ear, "Don't worry. With Zijin's talent, she should be at least at the insightful void stage now. Although you made me very angry, I still have to thank you. After all, you let me see her again, although it was only once." At this point, Chen Shi suddenly withdrew the long sword in his hand. As a stream of blood splattered, Yu Zijin's body slowly fell to the ground. As she fell, her figure became more and more blurry. Finally, she turned into crystal dust and disappeared in front of Chen Shi. Everything returned to silence. A broken mirror suddenly appeared where Yu Zijin had been standing. That was the array core. The mirror was broken. This array that could see through one's heart had finally been broken by Chen Shi. However, although the array was broken, Chen Shi did not look happy at all. He raised his head and looked at the fog that was still surging above his head. After a long time, Chen Shi finally let out a deep breath. Looking back at the broken mirror, he murmured in a low voice, "It's too late. I'm sorry." This apology was not for the mirror in front of him, but for Goddess Zijin, who was far away in heavenly spiral. "I'm sorry." Chapter 251. The illusion array was broken by Chen Shi. Therefore, there was only a broken mirror left in this huge square. Chen Shi looked around silently, but his expression was a bit more dignified. This place was too strange. The 5 elements of metal, wood, water, fire, and earth had all appeared. So what should I do next? There was no stone path in this square. It seemed that this was the end. Chen Shi looked around and didn't find anything out of the ordinary. Only then did she set her eyes on the broken mirror on the ground. This mirror was not made of glass. Looking carefully, the material was somewhat similar to crystal. It seemed to be a pure and colorless transparent crystal. And just when Chen Shi looked down and carefully studied the mirror fragments on the ground, the scattered mirror fragments suddenly had a magical change. Like snow meeting the sun, countless small mirror fragments suddenly began to melt at a speed visible to the naked eye. Even if the snow melted, there had to be a process. But the scene in front of Chen Shi was like pressing the fast-forward button when watching a video. The melting process became very short. In just a few seconds, the mirror fragments on the ground had turned into a pool of silver water. It looked a bit like tin, chromium, and other metals after melting. Seeing this, Chen Shi immediately took a few steps back. And just as he stepped back, a strong light suddenly appeared in the pool of silver water. A light curtain suddenly rose from it and reached the sky. Array within an array? Looking at the changes in front of him, Chen Shi couldn't help but frown. This 5 elements great array was strange enough on its own. Who would have thought that there would be another array within it? The pool of silver water in front of him, it was clearly the entrance to another array formation. After seeing the power of the earth array, Chen Shi couldn't help but have a trace of vigilance in his heart. Who was the one who had set up such a marvelous large-scale formation? What was the purpose? With countless questions, Chen Shi hesitated for a moment, but finally chose to step into the light curtain in front of him. Since he was already here, he might as well figure it out. After walking into the light curtain, Chen Shi's line of sight was completely blocked by a strong light. However, the strong light disappeared quickly. And when the strong light faded, Chen Shi found himself in a circular hall. This hall was very large. In terms of scale, it seemed to be larger than the bird's nest. The hall was spacious and grand. The closer to the center of the hall, the higher the dome. And in the center of the hall, there was a huge stone pillar supporting the dome. Because of this, the overall shape of the hall looked somewhat like an umbrella. Standing in the middle of the hall was like standing under a huge umbrella. Chen Shi had just walked out of the light curtain and didn't have time to carefully examine the surrounding environment when a familiar voice rang in his ears. "Mr. Chen?" Chen Shi looked and saw He Tiangang and the others sitting in a corner of the hall. However, the number of people was much smaller. The 4 professors were still there, as were Li Taidan and Xue Shuzhen. However, there were only a few people left in the Grandmaster Guard sent by Wu Lian. After the remaining 10 or so people saw Chen Shi appear, their faces immediately showed extremely excited expressions. "What are you guys doing?" Chen Shi came in front of them and could not help but frown. Take He Tiangang, who had the highest martial cultivation, for example. He Tiangang did not look like a great grandmaster in the gang state. His beard was unkempt, his face was dirty, and his body was constantly emitting a foul smell. It looked like he had not bathed for a long time. His current appearance was somewhat similar to a homeless person on the street. Seeing Chen Shi's puzzled look, the excitement on He Tiangang's face slowly disappeared. After that, a look of self-blame and regret appeared on his face. He could not help but sigh. "Mr. Chen, it's all my fault. I shouldn't have thrown away the stone that you gave me. What's going on? We can't find a way out. We're trapped here." He Tiangang quickly explained the matter to Qin Shi. It turned out that not long after the sun went down, the fog rose. Under He Tiangang's lead, the people cautiously tried to leave the oasis. However, no matter how they walked, they would eventually come to the giant tree. This situation should be the legendary ghostly wall. He Tiangang had no choice but to approach the giant tree and try to find clues from it. He did not expect that this would trigger the formation door and make a passage appear in front of them. What happened after that was similar to what happened to Qin Shi. Metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. He Tiangang and the others had a mission, so they naturally did not dare to act rashly in the face of all kinds of strange situations. However, for some reason, along the way, although everyone knew that the things in the square were not to be touched, there were still people who could not control themselves and ran to touch those traps, thus losing their lives in vain. They kept moving forward in fear until they came to the hall in front of them. The hall was not dangerous, but there were no doors or windows. It was like a prison, completely trapping them here. After listening to He Tiangang's explanation, Qin Shi could not help but frown. Not to mention the metal, wood, water, and fire formations, just based on the earth formation at the end. How many people in this world could walk out alive with the exquisite layout of the formation within the formation? Qin Shi thought that they had been wiped out long ago. Thinking of this, Qin Shi could not help but ask in confusion, "How did you pass through the earth formation?" Hearing this, He Tiangang was stunned and asked in confusion, "Earth formation? What's an earth formation?" "An illusion formation, like a dream. It will make you lose yourself in the dream and unable to wake up." "You didn't encounter it?" "No." He Tiangang shook his head, as if he understood Qin Shi's question. He then explained, "The earth formation you're talking about is the last square, right? There was nothing there, only a mirror. We couldn't find any other way, so in the end, we tried to break the mirror, but we didn't expect to come here." After listening to He Tiangang's description, Qin Shi was silent. Directly skipping the earth formation? Based on the power of the earth formation, once they entered, there was absolutely no chance of survival for everyone present. Why didn't they trigger the earth formation? Could it be, the earth formation only targeted immortal cultivators? Qin Shi thought silently. He looked at He Tiangang, then at the rest of the people. Then, he suddenly thought of a question, so he quickly asked, "How long have you been here?" Hearing this, He Tiangang could not help but smile bitterly and shake his head, sighing. "It's been more than a month, we only brought 2 months' worth of rations. If we can't find a way out, I'm afraid we'll starve to death here." "More than a month?" Because he was too shocked, Qin Shi's face immediately showed an extremely shocked expression. He had not lost his composure like this for a long time. How long had it been since He Tiangang threw the stone, then entered the formation and found the hall? It had only been a few hours. How could more than a month have passed? The flow of time in this place, could it be the same as Tianxian? Chapter 252. A year on Earth was equivalent to 100 years on Heavenly Spiral. How long had it been since He Tiangang and the others entered the formation? How could more than a month have passed? Although he was very confused, Qin Shi quickly regained his composure. They didn't notice anything unusual. After all, when it came to time, it was obviously not a problem that ordinary cultivators could solve. Perhaps only the legendary immortal emperors would be able to see through the true meaning behind it. If that was the case, then this palace, could it be that this was an excellent place for cultivation? Just like the House of Mind in Dragon Ball, a year in the outside world was only a day inside. A cultivation place like this was close to being a bug in the system. The flow of time in different places in the universe was different. In Einstein's theory of relativity, it was believed that time and space were related. When combined together, they would form a four-dimensional spacetime coordinate and participate in the process of physical changes. A typical example could be given. For example, the greater the mass of an object, the slower the time around it would become. This was demonstrated very directly in Interstellar. Because it was close to a black hole, the male and female protagonists stayed on a planet full of water for a few hours. However, the crew members on the spaceship had already stayed on the spaceship for 23 years. When the male and female protagonists returned to the spaceship and met the crew members again, the crew members had already become white-haired old men. The reason why the flow of time on Heavenly Spiral was different from that of Earth was obviously because the mass of Heavenly Spiral was much greater than that of Earth. However, this palace was on Earth, so, what was the reason for the flow of time in this palace to be different from that of the outside world? She was only at the soul formation stage. He hadn't even comprehended the void. Naturally, it was impossible for him to comprehend the true meaning of time. Therefore, after frowning and thinking for a while, he decisively threw this inexplicable phenomenon to the back of his mind. The most important thing now was to find a way to leave this palace. As for the rest, he would think about it later. Thinking of this, she couldn't help but look up at the dome. There were circles of strange patterns on the dome. It was as if a large net was hanging in the sky. He looked down at his feet. The floor of the palace looked dark and shiny. The material seemed to be obsidian. The floor was not flat because there were many protruding lines on it. They looked similar to the lines on the dome. In the large hall, the white dome and black floor actually presented a different kind of beauty due to the similarity of the veined patterns. Apart from the giant stone pillar that supported the dome, there was nothing else in the hall. She circled the stone pillar but didn't find anything out of the ordinary. So, in front of everyone's surprised eyes, he jumped up and flew directly to the dome. Seeing this, Tiangang couldn't help but smile. He clenched his fists and shouted excitedly, "We're saved!" Hearing this, the Wu Lian people were all overjoyed. The person in front of him was a legendary celestial. He must have a way to get them out of this damned place. Li Taidan and Xue Shuzhen had been by Shi's side for a few days now. When they saw Shi suddenly reveal such an inhuman side, they were shocked. Their eyes were wide open and they couldn't say a word. Mr. Chen could fly? Could he be Superman? The people below were very excited, but after Shi flew to the dome, he couldn't help but frown. There was no light source in the hall, but it was still as bright as day. There wasn't even a shadow. Standing in the hall was like standing under a shadowless lamp. There wasn't even a shadow to be seen. The light source seemed to be on the dome. She took a closer look and found that the material of the dome was somewhat like stone, but it had a faint metallic luster. It looked similar to the stone tablet at the entrance that was engraved with the words warding off evil and sealing demons. She reached out his right hand and was about to touch the dome. However, the moment his palm touched the dome, the originally solemn hall suddenly shook violently. She was shocked and quickly retreated a few meters. Then he realized that the movement was coming from the stone pillar that supported the dome. The stone pillar kept shaking, and a strong force seemed to be breaking out of it. Seeing this, Shi immediately shouted to the people below, "Be careful!" Just as he finished speaking. Like a fragmented grenade exploding in the hall, the giant stone pillar that supported the dome suddenly broke apart and turned into countless pieces that shot out in all directions. Shi's figure suddenly disappeared in the air. When he reappeared, he was already in front of Tiangang and the others. He held the sword with both hands and placed the Tianyan sword in front of his chest. A light shield suddenly rose and protected Tiangang and the others. The giant stone pillar was at least 10 meters in diameter. Now that it suddenly exploded, thousands of pieces shot out in all directions in the hall, and there was a continuous crackling sound. If Shi wasn't here, Tiangang and the others would have been turned into a sieve by the flying pieces of stone, and there wouldn't even be a corpse left. The explosion soon subsided, and the pieces of the stone pillar were spread all over the floor. After Shi removed the light shield, Tiangang and the others carefully began to look around. The explosion just now was very fierce, but there wasn't even a scratch on the walls of the hall. From this, it could be seen how sturdy the hall was. The giant stone pillar that supported the dome turned into rubble, and at this moment, a pillar of light suddenly shot down from the dome. The pillar of light replaced the original stone pillar. Seeing this, Chen Shi suddenly stabbed the Tian sword into the ground. A light shield rose again, enveloping He Tiangang and the others. All of you stay here, don't move. After instructing everyone, Chen Shi walked out of the light shield. Like sunlight peeking through the gaps in the clouds, the pillar of light was golden, and it faintly emitted a strong pressure. The pillar of light grew brighter and brighter. Everyone quickly averted their gazes. There was no way they could open their eyes in such a strong light. At this moment, Chen Shi sharply noticed that a black shadow had appeared in the strong light. Roar! Following an earth-shattering roar, a snake-like thing suddenly pounced out of the pillar of light, heading straight for Chen Shi. Seeing this, Chen Shi immediately grasped the air, and a new celestial sword Dharma appeared in his hand. As soon as the celestial sword Dharma was formed, Chen Shi held the long sword in his hand and directly slashed at the black shadow. A sword hidden in the air. The green sword radiance suddenly burst out. Like a long river hanging upside down, it swept up surging true core energy and rushed into the sky, straight into the clouds. Roar! The black shadow let out a loud roar, and then collided with the sword radiance. Invisible energy waves exploded from the center of the collision, and instantly set off a strong wind storm in the hull. At this moment, Chen Shi saw the black shadow clearly. It was actually a dragon. It wasn't a winged four-legged lizard in Western myths and legends, but a divine dragon that represented Hua Xia's spiritual culture. A creature that only existed in myths and legends had now appeared in front of Chen Shi's eyes. Chapter 253. Ere Ye Wings said, the dragon is the head of the scaled insect. It has 9 shapes, the head is like a camel, the horns are like a deer, the eyes are like a rabbit, the ears are like a cow, the neck is like a snake, the belly is like a snake, the scales are like a carp, the claws are like an eagle, the palms are like a tiger. There are 81 scales on its back, and it has the number of 99 suns. Its voice is like a copper plate, there is a beard beside its mouth, a pearl under its chin, and a reverse scale under its throat. There is a mountain on its head, also known as the ruler of wood. The dragon cannot fly without a ruler of wood. It can form clouds with its breath, and it can change into water and fire. But what is strange is that the appearance of this dragon is still somewhat different from the legendary 5-clawed golden dragon. The 5-clawed golden dragon is obviously golden, but the dragon in front of Chen Shi is dark green. Or, this is an azure dragon. This azure dragon's body is about 30 meters long, and it seems to be bigger than the giant python in the Berserk Python disaster. It arches its body and floats in the air, and the dark green scales are at least the size of a palm. Looking carefully, the scales seem to be shining with an indescribable luster, which can be called flowing light and colorful. Dragons are a symbol of auspiciousness, but its appearance is definitely not cute, and it even looks a little ferocious. When this azure dragon stares at Chen Shi with its golden vertical pupils, its eyes suddenly become like a human's, suddenly with a bit of fierceness. In this regard, Chen Shi did not have much reaction, but the group of people behind him were frightened. Among them, a few of the less resolute ones were so frightened that they fell to the ground. This is a living dragon. After the azure dragon flew out of the light pillar, it immediately roared at Chen Shi. The hidden dragon has fallen asleep, and its roar moves thousands of mountains. Seeing that the azure dragon was about to pounce, Chen Shi raised his hand and slashed. However, this azure dragon did not dodge. When the sword hit its body, it was immediately like a water arrow hitting its body, and was immediately scattered by the dragon's scales. The azure dragon did not seem to expect that this little bug would dare to provoke its majesty, so it immediately roared. Following that, it danced in the air and pounced on Chen Shi, who was on the ground. It waved its gigantic body and slammed down like a giant wave. Seeing this, Chen Shi couldn't help but frown. Could it be, was he going to slay a dragon today? Seeing this azure dragon charging over menacingly, Chen Shi naturally could not sit still and wait for death. No matter what it was, he would beat it into submission first. Thus, Chen Shi immediately held the Tian sword in front of his chest. The tip of the sword suddenly shone brightly, releasing a burst of golden light. It was as bright as the sun, instantly illuminating the entire palace. Condense the will as the spirit, and the spirit as the sword. The 8 extremities boundless expanse was the so-called Earth Sword. 49 Forms of Heavenly Divination, Sword Technique Chapter. He Tiangang and the others hid behind the shield that Qin Shi had set up for them. When they saw what was happening in front of them, they couldn't help but cry out in alarm. After Qin Shi slashed out with his sword, a burst of golden light shone brightly. The blinding light made it impossible for them to look directly at it, so they could only cover their eyes in pain. There was no word that could describe the sharpness of this sword. It was as if it could split the heavens and earth in half. Qin Shi stood proudly with his sword in hand. The azure dragon's figure was no longer in his eyes, only a golden sword light that pierced through the heavens and earth. Then, the blue wave and the golden light collided violently. Roar! Following the azure dragon's roar, the entire palace began to shake violently. The stone pillars that were scattered all over the ground were now completely turned into fine powder under the impact of wave after wave of force. They were reduced to dust that could not even be seen by the naked eye. One move of the human sword was enough to wipe out a mountain, not to mention that Qin Shi had just used the earth sword. But strangely, in the face of such a powerful impact, although the palace was shaking violently, the surrounding walls were not damaged at all. Not even a small crack appeared. When the golden light dissipated, other than the huge stone pillar that supported the dome, only a thick layer of dust was left on the obsidian floor. Everything seemed to be as good as new. As for the azure dragon, it was actually not affected at all. The azure dragon's speed was very fast. As soon as Qin Shi slashed out with the earth sword, it had already arrived in front of Qin Shi. Qin Shi didn't even have time to slash out a second time before the azure dragon bared its fangs and claws and bit towards Qin Shi. Seeing this, Qin Shi's body suddenly glowed with golden light. He used his true qi to form a shield and prepared to take the azure dragon's attack head-on. But at this time, the azure dragon's figure directly passed through his body. Passed through, Qin Shi was stunned. Because at this time, he realized that the azure dragon was not real. It was just an illusion. No, it's wrong to call it an illusion, because it clearly received his attack just now. Qin Shi raised his eyebrows and was about to turn around and slash again. But at this time, the azure dragon had already passed through the shield he set up for He Tiangang and crashed into He Tiangang's body. Although He Tiangang was a great master in the Alcade state, but to be honest, the Alcade state was only equivalent to a cultivator in the qi refining stage. A battle of this level was obviously beyond He Tiangang's understanding. Therefore, He Tiangang's mind was blank. He didn't even have time to react. He could only watch as the 30-meter-long azure dragon drilled into his body. Yes, the azure dragon drilled into his body. The azure dragon's speed was very fast. In the blink of an eye, it had completely entered He Tiangang's body. Because this scene was so shocking, He Tiangang couldn't come back to his senses at all. Until the azure dragon's figure disappeared from the hall and completely entered his body, He Tiangang still had a blank expression on his face. He Tiangang raised his hand and wanted to touch his chest. But at this time, a painful expression suddenly flashed across his face, and then he suddenly closed his eyes. Soon, He Tiangang opened his eyes again. But when he opened his eyes again, He Tiangang's eyes had turned into a pair of golden vertical pupils. They looked like the eyes of the azure dragon just now. At first glance, it was obvious that they were not eyes that a normal human could have. How dare you, evil creature! Seeing this scene, Qin Shi couldn't help but fly into a rage. Because he finally understood, he had been fooled. No wonder the stone tablet at the entrance of the formation was engraved with the words, "Seal evil and repel demons." Could it be that the formation was suppressing this azure dragon? But this azure dragon was clearly just a remnant soul. It was only because his divine soul was damaged that Qin Shi didn't notice the abnormality at first. Looking at He Tiangang's current appearance, it was obvious that this azure dragon had taken over his body. Seeing this, Qin Shi immediately let go of the long sword, and then suddenly clasped his hands in front of his chest. Since this azure dragon was just a remnant soul, he would destroy its divine soul today. 49 Styles of Heavenly Divination, Spell Section. Chapter 254. Possession. When Chen Shi saw what was happening to He Tiangang, he immediately flew into a rage. After letting out an angry grunt, Chen Shi suddenly clasped his hands together in front of his chest. Then, he slowly pulled his palms apart. A golden light suddenly appeared between Chen Shi's palms. As he slowly pulled his palms apart, the golden light became brighter and brighter. In the end, it was as if Chen Shi was holding the sun in his hands. The dazzling light that seeped through the gaps between his fingers was so blinding that it was impossible to look at it directly. The golden light in Chen Shi's hands grew even brighter. But in the eyes of the Wu Yan people. But they didn't see anything. This was because Evil Vanquisher was an attack on the soul. They were not immortal cultivators, so they naturally could not sense the fluctuations in the surrounding spiritual energy. However, although the others could not see it, the azure dragon in front of them clearly knew what was good for it. He Tiangang could be considered to have 8 lifetimes of bad luck. This azure dragon had probably been suppressed for too long, so as soon as it was released, it wanted to find a body to possess. It was not that the azure dragon was not interested in Chen Shi, but the strength that Chen Shi displayed just now was too strong. The azure dragon did not have absolute confidence, so it could only settle for the next best thing. Among everyone present, apart from Chen Shi, He Tiangang's cultivation level was the highest. Naturally, he became the azure dragon's first target for possession. Because the difference in cultivation level between the two was too great, the azure dragon immediately seized control of He Tiangang's body as soon as it entered. After He Tiangang's body was possessed, his eyeballs immediately underwent a huge change. The pair of golden vertical pupils that originally belonged to the azure dragon appeared in He Tiangang's eye sockets, giving off a very strange feeling. Upon closer inspection, this pair of eyes that did not belong to a human seemed to faintly shine with an indescribable cold light. At this moment, Chen Shi suddenly flipped his palm and pushed forward. The white sun flame immediately released a boundless pressure. It was like a spear filled with killing intent, and it instantly blasted towards He Tiangang. Seeing this, He Tiangang's eyes couldn't help but tremble. The vertical pupils in his eye sockets strangely shrank, completely turning into fine lines. But then, his pupils suddenly widened, and there were 2 balls of red flames that kept pulsating in them. Then, He Tiangang opened his mouth and let out a roar at Chen Shi that did not sound like a human at all. Roar. Following the roar, the 2 flames suddenly turned into 2 crimson dragons. A mighty fire tornado suddenly gushed out from He Tiangang's eyes, sweeping towards Chen Shi. The golden light and the crimson flame collided violently. In an instant, like a cannonball hitting an armory, a shocking explosion occurred in the hall. The air seemed to be ignited by the raging flames, and the raging flames filled the entire space. However, this was a battle on the level of the spirit, so to outsiders, it was as if nothing had happened. Chen Shi's spirit was damaged and could not directly use divine telekinesis to fight. But after such a long time of accumulation, his cultivation had mostly recovered, so the power of Evil Vanquisher was naturally far greater than before. However, what Chen Shi did not expect was that his Evil Vanquisher, which he had used all his strength to unleash, was still blocked by the flames spewing out from He Tiangang's eyes. It was obvious how strong the remnant soul of this azure dragon was. Although Wu Yan and the others couldn't see what Chen Shi and He Tiangang were doing, a battle of spirits of this level, just the spiritual storm created by the collision was enough to give them a splitting headache. Naturally, they couldn't pay attention to what was happening around them. Iron Egg Li and Xue Shuzhen were professional soldiers with strong willpower, but even so, they bitterly held on for about 5 seconds before their eyes rolled back and they completely fainted. If even they were in such a state, there was no need to mention an ordinary person like Professor He, who had no foundation in cultivation. Seeing their companions collapse one after another, the remaining neutralizing grandmasters gritted their teeth and held on for about 10 seconds before collapsing to the ground one after another. Only 2 people remained standing in the hall. In contrast to Chen Shi's calm and collected appearance, He Tiangang's condition was clearly much worse. Not only was his face pale, but his forehead was also covered in sweat. His tired appearance made him look like an athlete who had just finished a round of a marathon. After all, the Azure Dragon had just successfully taken over this body. This level of exhaustion was naturally a bit too much for it to bear. So when it saw Qinshi acting as if nothing had happened, the Azure Dragon's heart immediately trembled. It couldn't help but use He Tiangong's body to speak. "You are very strong. I have no grudge with you, let me leave. I will remember your kindness." His accent was very strange. He sounded like a foreigner. It was just a short sentence, but it took a lot of effort to speak. Obviously, the Azure Dragon hadn't gotten used to this body yet and couldn't control it skillfully. Hearing this, Qinshi looked at him deeply, then replied with a serious face, "I can let you go, but the premise is, you have to leave his body." "No, no." Hearing that Qinshi wanted it to leave He Tiangong's body, the Azure Dragon immediately replied, "Without a body, I can't leave here." "Okay, then there's nothing to talk about." Qinshi shrugged indifferently, then said with a regretful expression, "I brought him here. You took over his body right in front of me, and now you want to leave safely like nothing happened? Let me tell you, there's no such thing as a cheap deal in this world." After hearing Qinshi's words, He Tiangong's expression immediately became uncertain, as if he was thinking. But Qinshi didn't intend to give him too much time to think. Although He Tiangong's body was occupied by the Azure Dragon, his consciousness obviously couldn't be swallowed by the Azure Dragon so quickly. So as long as the Azure Dragon's remnant soul was driven out of He Tiangong's body, then He Tiangang could still be saved. If time dragged on and the Azure Dragon completely merged with this body, even a golden immortal couldn't do anything. Seeing that the Azure Dragon still didn't answer, Qinshi decisively spread out his hands, and two dazzling lights lit up in his palms again. Since Evil Punisher couldn't destroy it, then he could try another move. Anyway, he had plenty of tricks up his sleeves. Seeing that Qinshi seemed to want to fight again, the Azure Dragon immediately cowered, so it quickly said, "Wait. I have an idea." Hearing this, Qinshi immediately retracted his hands and asked, "What idea?" "You help me open the channel. After the channel is open, I'll come out from his body, then you cover me and leave, okay?" Qinshi pondered for a moment, so he readily agreed to the Azure Dragon's request. There was no exit in this hall, and the four walls were incomparably hard. Presumably, only the Azure Dragon knew how to get out. Since that was the case, there was no harm in cooperating. He helped the Azure Dragon escape, and the Azure Dragon left He Tiangong's body. Chapter 255. The man and the dragon quickly reached a consensus. After that, Qinshi learned the way to leave the hall from He Tiangang. The hall was like a sealed jar, and the only way out was above the dome. In the center of the dome, where the light beam came from, there was a crystal-like thing. As long as Qinshi flew up and took the crystal, they could leave this place. It sounded very simple, so Qinshi flew directly to the dome according to what the Azure Dragon said, and found a crystal in the center of the dome. It was a hexagonal rhombus-shaped crystal, and its size was about the same as the crystal trophy used in award ceremonies. Qinshi tried to dig at the crystal with his hand, but to his surprise, the crystal was easily removed. The moment Qinshi removed the crystal, it was as if there was a huge earthquake outside, causing the entire hall to shake violently. Qinshi looked down and found that several cracks suddenly appeared on the walls around the hall. It was not right to call them cracks, because these cracks were very neat, as if they could have been separated. Under Qinshi's slightly surprised gaze, the hall bloomed like a lotus in summer. The ground turned into a lotus pod, the walls turned into petals, and bloomed in front of Qinshi. The arc-shaped walls fell out one by one at a very fast speed, but they did not make any sound when they fell. The wind and snow that filled the sky suddenly came. Qinshi looked up and found that he was now in an observatory, and the spirit fog that covered the sky and the moon had disappeared. Everything happened very quickly. The moment the cracks appeared on the walls of the hall, He Tiangang suddenly showed a look of ecstasy. Almost without any hesitation, just as the wall cracked to reveal a gap big enough for an adult to leave, the Azure Dragon controlled He Tiangong's body and jumped out of the hall. Run! As for the agreement between it and Qin Shi, it was originally the Azure Dragon's stalling tactic. In fact, the Azure Dragon had never thought of leaving He Tiangong's body. After all, the heaven-defying act of seizing another's body was not without restrictions. This time, in order to seize He Tiangong's body, the Azure Dragon had already paid a great price. Therefore, Qin Shi wanted it to obediently leave He Tiangong's body and look for a new body to seize. In the Azure Dragon's eyes, this was simply wishful thinking. With only a strand of remnant soul left, it could be said to be a rootless duckweed. Now that it had finally found a place to stay, the Azure Dragon naturally would not give up so easily. Although this body was still too weak at the moment, as long as it was given enough time, the Azure Dragon was confident that it could transform it into its original body. The little abacus in Azure Dragon's heart rang loudly, but it missed the most important point. That was, it did not have a correct understanding of Qin Shi's cultivation. Therefore, as soon as He Tiangong moved, Qin Shi, who was flying in the air, lowered his head and looked at He Tiangong's fleeing figure. There's a path to heaven, but you don't want to take it. There's no door to hell, but you insist on barging in. Since you're going back on your word, don't blame me for being merciless. Qin Shi spread out his hands, and the vital essence in his body surged. Immediately, 2 balls of light appeared in his palms. Then, Qin Shi held the 2 balls of light and quickly gestured in front of his chest. Suddenly, he slammed his palms toward He Tiangong's back. 49 Forms of Heavenly Divination, Soul Dao Chapter. Tai Suppression, 3 Qis as 1, Soul Catcher. Soul Catcher was slightly different from Evil Vanquisher, because Soul Catcher was a pure spiritual attack. Qin Shi's spiritual injury was very serious, so the moment he forcefully used Soul Catcher, his face flushed red. This move could be said to hurt the enemy 1,000 times, but hurt himself 800 times. However, the Azure Dragon had gone back on its word first, so today, Qin Shi was determined to destroy its soul. No matter what kind of position it had in Chinese culture, in short, today, the proud dragon has no regrets. Perhaps sensing the pressure coming from behind, He Tiangong stepped on the snow and quickly leaped out. At the same time, he did not forget to look back. When he saw the golden light in Qin Shi's hands, He Tiangong suddenly stopped. Then, he turned toward Qin Shi and let out a resounding dragon roar. Roar! The roar of a tiger and the roar of a dragon was mighty and continuous. The Azure Dragon probably knew that today's matter could not be settled peacefully. Therefore, after this deep roar sounded from afar, the shadow of an Azure Dragon suddenly appeared behind He Tiangong. The hidden dragon sleeps, and its roar shakes thousands of mountains. The shadow of the Azure Dragon coiled in the air. At the same time that Qin Shi slammed his palms, the shadow of the Azure Dragon soared into the air with a monstrous force. Like a giant python pouncing on its prey, it opened its bloody mouth and rushed toward Qin Shi. At this moment, Qin Shi seemed to see the shadow of great-granduncle in it. It was a very familiar scene, but Qin Shi did not have time to think about it. Because, the Soul Catcher had been released. Like a descendant shooting down the sun, 2 light arrows shot out from Qin Shi's hands, directly toward the shadow of the Azure Dragon that was pouncing toward him. And at the moment when the light arrows and the shadow of the Azure Dragon collided in the air, the whole scene between heaven and earth seemed to be frozen. Snow fluttered in the snowy mountains. Under the sparse moonlight, the wind and snow filled the sky. The light arrows shot in from the dragon's head. After a flash, they pierced through the entire shadow of the Azure Dragon and directly entered He Tiangong's body. The resounding dragon roar sounded again, but this time it did not come from He Tiangong's mouth. Instead, it came from the shadow of the Azure Dragon. As if it had suffered a huge injury, the shadow of the Azure Dragon trembled violently. Then, it curled up into a circle in the air, raised its head and roared angrily toward the sky. Formless sound waves continuously sounded from the mouth of the Azure Dragon. Circle after circle, they spread in all directions. At the same time, He Tiangong, who was on the ground, stared with his slightly ferocious golden vertical pupils. There was a trace of disbelief on his face. However, the surprise on his face did not last long. After a few breaths of time, Tiangang suddenly closed his eyes under the expressionless gaze of Chen Shi, and then fell into the thick snow. At this time, the shadow of the azure dragon in the air, like a group of disturbed fireflies, suddenly turned into specks of starlight and disappeared in the wind and snow. The soul was destroyed. This azure dragon that only existed in myths and legends was mercilessly obliterated by Chen Shi. Everything returned to silence. Only the sound of the wind was left between heaven and earth. After looking at the diamond-shaped crystal in his hand thoughtfully, Chen Shi looked down at the hall below. Chapter 256. Chen Shi flew in the air and looked down at the scenery below. The thick spirit fog had dissipated, so his field of vision was wide open. After carefully observing his surroundings, Chen Shi found that he was now on a snowy mountain not far from the Siala mountain pass. In other words, although the formation entrance was in the oasis, the formation core was the unknown snowy mountain next to it. The walls around the hall were not closed, like an open-air camp. The dark ground was in stark contrast to the surrounding white snow. The wind and snow were too strong, and the temperature was at least -60 degrees Celsius. Therefore, in just a few minutes, Wu Lian and the others lying on the ground were covered with a thin layer of snow. Chen Shi estimated that they would not wake up for a while, so he moved the survivors to the temporary laboratory in the oasis. After settling the group of people, Chen Shi flew back to the spacious hall and began to carefully study the rhombus-shaped crystal in his hand. This rhombus-shaped crystal was transparent, and a faint purple mist constantly rose in the middle. Chen Shi held his breath and silently felt the cold feeling coming from the crystal. But after studying it for a while, he still could not detect any signs of energy fluctuations from it. It was as if it was just an ordinary piece of natural crystal. But that was obviously impossible. If the hall was the cage that imprisoned the azure dragon, then this crystal was obviously the key. It was just that Chen Shi did not know how to use this key. The flow of time in the hall was different from the outside world, so this kind of cultivation place was undoubtedly very attractive to the current Chen Shi. If he had the key to the hall, then he could come here to cultivate when he had nothing to do. A cultivation place comparable to Tianxian. How could Chen Shi not be tempted? Thinking of this, Chen Shi could not help but show a trace of annoyance on his face. If he had known, he would not have hit so hard. The azure dragon didn't keep its word. Chen Shi was worried that Tiangang's soul would be devoured by the azure dragon if it dragged on, so he decisively killed him. Now that he thought about it, it was quite a pity. The main hall was obviously a cage used to suppress the azure dragon. Although they did not know how long it had been imprisoned here, judging from the azure dragon's behavior just now, it clearly had a certain degree of understanding of this main hall. However, it was too late to say anything now. He had already killed the azure dragon, so Chen Shi could only slowly explore the secrets of the hall. After pondering for a while, Chen Shi began pouring his true essence into the crystal. When the true essence flowed into the crystal, the dense purple qi in the crystal began to surge. There's hope. Seeing this, Chen Shi couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. He began to madly pour his qi into the crystal. The surging true essence continued to flow into the crystal, and the dense purple qi inside immediately began to revolve. As the dense purple gas spun faster and faster, a faint purple vortex gradually formed in the crystal like a glass of water being shaken. After that, Chen Shi held the crystal and looked at the main hall expectantly. However, he waited for a while, but there was no movement in the main hall. Is it scrapped? Chen Shi frowned and muttered to himself. Only then did he fly into the main hall and look at the surroundings with some regret. Before the main hall was unsealed, it was like a flower bud that had not bloomed. After Chen Shi plucked the crystal, the lotus began to bloom. With the base of the main hall as the center, the walls fell back one by one and split into 16 petals. The shape of each side was quite similar to the petals of the lotus. This shape, it did not look like the 9 lotus seats under the gods. Chen Shi came to one of the walls and began to touch and knock on it, trying to find some useful clues. However, after studying for a while, he did not find anything strange, so he had to give up helplessly. This main hall was probably the same as the formation, which was a one-time use, so there was no way to restore it after it was activated. What a pity, Qinshi flew to the top of the main hall against the wind and snow. After reluctantly looking back at the black lotus blooming on the top of the snow mountain, he was about to leave with some regret. However, at the moment he turned around, Qinshi suddenly remembered a sentence that the Azure Dragon once said. Without a body, I can't leave here. Without a body, there was no way to leave here. Once this place was opened, the wind would blow on all sides. How could he not get out? Thinking of this, Qinshi could not help but raise his eyebrows. He immediately turned around and flew into the main hall. Then, he sat cross-legged on the obsidian floor. After setting up a defensive formation, he began to try to let his soul out of his body. Soul out of the body. For Qinshi, whose soul had been damaged, this was actually a very dangerous thing to do. If he was not careful, his soul might be destroyed, leaving only an empty shell without a soul. It was difficult for Qinshi to even use his divine sense, let alone his soul out of his body. Therefore, just as he was about to leave his body, he immediately suffered a backlash. His face could not help but turn pale. Qinshi had no choice but to temporarily stop this dangerous behavior, and then silently adjust his breathing. Danger always accompanied opportunity. This cultivation place was extremely tempting to Qinshi, so he did not want to give it up. Therefore, after a simple adjustment, Qinshi began to try again. Bit by bit, he let his soul out of his body. The shape of the soul was not fixed. Although the Azure Dragon had been imprisoned for a long time, its soul had always maintained the appearance of its original body. From this, one could see the strength of the Azure Dragon's soul. Because Qinshi's soul was damaged, his soul looked like a weak flame. It was so weak that it could be extinguished by the wind at any time. When the flame flew out from between Qinshi's eyebrows, Qinshi entered a mysterious state. He didn't need eyes or ears, but he could clearly see everything around him. Even how a snowflake fell from the sky and how many times it spun in the air, Qinshi was very clear. This was the so-called divine sense. It was a type of perception that transcended the five senses. It was like a radar, and even the rustling of grass in the wind could not escape his divine sense. After his soul left his body, Qinshi, who had turned into a flame, carefully approached the edge of the hall. And just as Qinshi's soul was about to float out of the hall, a bright light suddenly appeared in front of him. Sure enough. Although the hall was still in the shape of a lotus platform, when Qinshi's soul approached the edge of the lotus platform, circles of strange light patterns immediately appeared around him. Looking carefully, the light patterns were exactly the same as the patterns carved on the dome. Looking at the ground, the protruding lines on the obsidian floor were also strangely glowing at this moment. In an instant, the sky and the ground were full of light patterns. Like two large nets, Qinshi was firmly trapped in the center of the hall. Inescapable net. Chapter 257. Looking at the strange light patterns that covered the sky in front of him, Qinshi was not surprised, but happy. Through the perception of his divine sense, he had already keenly noticed that the diamond-shaped crystal in his hand had a new change. The dense purple gas in the middle of the crystal was originally in the shape of a whirlpool, but when Qinshi's divine sense floated to the edge of the hall, the whirlpool immediately turned into the shape of a lotus, and the shape looked somewhat similar to the current appearance of the hall. Seeing this, Qinshi immediately returned his divine sense to his body, ending this dangerous action. After his divine sense returned to his body, Qinshi was still sitting cross-legged on the ground. After silently adjusting for a while, he finally opened his eyes. Forcing his divine sense to leave his body was still too much for the current Qinshi. Therefore, after just a few minutes, his face became very pale, and he looked like a patient who had just recovered from a serious illness. However, although his face was ugly, Qinshi could not help but smile. Because he discovered a secret, and that was, this seemingly ordinary crystal was actually the legendary soul crystal. The so-called soul crystal was actually a strange crystal that could host the divine sense. This kind of crystal was also very rare in the Tianyuan world. The soul crystal was very precious. On one hand, it was extremely rare, and on the other hand, it was a necessary material to refine divine sense attack-type magic treasures. In addition to being able to refine magic treasures, the soul crystal, as a kind of spiritual treasure, had the effect of warming and nourishing the divine sense. With the environment on Earth, it was obviously impossible to breed a magical medicine that could heal divine sense injuries. Therefore, this soul crystal was definitely a life-saving straw for Qin Shi, whose divine sense was injured. No wonder this hall could imprison the azure dragon's divine sense. It was obviously because of this soul crystal. Thinking of this, Qin Shi had a rough understanding of the mechanism of the hall's operation. Using the soul crystal as the eye of the formation to imprison the azure dragon, who was only left with his divine sense. And the reason why he Tiangang and the others had not triggered any mechanism after being trapped for more than a month was, they were not immortal cultivators, so they did not have enough pure true essence to trigger the mechanism. Therefore, this array formation and the main hall were obviously set up by immortal cultivators. Moreover, this unknown, immortal cultivator was at least at the insightful emptiness realm. Otherwise, it would be impossible for him to set up such a grand formation that involved the true meaning of the word void. With the soul crystal as the core of the formation, if not for his appearance and triggering the mechanism in the hall, the azure dragon who had lost his physical body would never have been able to escape the seal. There are also immortal cultivators on Earth? Thinking of this, Qin Shi suddenly frowned. It was said that the proud dragon had no regrets, but now he was a little regretful. He should have left Azure Dragon alive to interrogate him, but what was done, and there was no point in regretting it now. Therefore, Qin Shi could only put this question aside for the time being. Then, he closed his eyes and concentrated, trying to let his spirit enter the soul crystal. The soul fire once again flew out from between Qin Shi's eyebrows, and then directly flew into the diamond-shaped crystal in his hand. After Qin Shi's spirit flew into the soul crystal, a feeling as warm as the sun in March immediately enveloped his spirit. It was a very wonderful experience, and it made Qin Shi feel very comfortable. His injured spirit could only sense things within a radius of 10 meters, but after his spirit entered the soul crystal, the range of Qin Shi's divine sense suddenly expanded and covered the entire mountain in an instant. In an instant, with the crystal as the center, Qin Shi could sense every movement in the wind and grass. This feeling, he had not experienced it for a long time. Nourishing the spirit was an additional effect of the soul crystal. Naturally, it would not be as fast as the magic medicine, and it would take a long time. Therefore, at this time, Qin Shi could not help but think of the main hall. As soon as he thought of this, a series of rumbling sounds suddenly came from the hall. Following that, the 16 walls began to slowly rise up and gradually close together. The main hall changed back to its original appearance. The soul crystal, which was the core of the array, could still control the main hall. Seeing this, Qin Shi could not help but feel happy. He immediately counted silently in his heart. He wanted to calculate the difference between the flow of time in the main hall and the outside world. Qin Shi enjoyed the nourishment of the soul crystal as he counted seriously. When he counted to 10,000, Qin Shi thought of something again. The main hall was suddenly like a remote-controlled toy, and it slowly bloomed with a rumbling sound. Each number was exactly 1 second. In other words, he stayed in the main hall for about 166 minutes. Before the main hall was fully opened, Qin Shi excitedly flew out of the main hall and rushed directly in the direction of the temporary laboratory. When he brought everyone back to the laboratory, it was about 1:30 in the morning. He counted 10,000 seconds in the main hall. 166 minutes, which was 7 hours. According to the flow of time that he Tiangang said, if the main hall did not lose its effect, then only about 2 minutes had passed in the outside world. The more Qin Shi thought about it, the more excited he became. He quickly rushed back to the oasis from the top of the mountain. There was a quartz clock in the temporary laboratory. The answer he wanted was there. The wind and snow were still in the sky. Thick dark clouds blocked the moonlight, so the surroundings were pitch black. After nervously opening the storm door of the laboratory, Qin Shi saw He Tiangang and the others, who were still unconscious. In the dim laboratory, only one energy-saving lamp was still on. Next to the energy-saving lamp was the quartz clock that Professor He had brought. Chen-Shi walked to the table and looked down at the time on the table. He was stunned. The time on the quartz clock indicated that it was 1:55 in the morning. When he left, the time should be around 1:34 in the morning. Putting aside some errors, it should be around 20 minutes. However, he stayed in the main hall for a full 10,000 seconds. In other words, the ratio of the flow of time between the main hall and the outside world should be about 8 times. It was not as exaggerated as 100. However, even if it was only 8 times the time difference, it was more than enough for Chen-Shi. One day in the outside world was 8 days in the main hall. What kind of concept was that? Chen-Shi thought about it for a while. However, he vaguely felt that something was wrong. According to what Tiangang said, they had been trapped in the hall for more than a month. Why was it that the time difference between the hall and the outside world was only 8 times that of the outside world? A month in the main hall should be at least 4 days in the outside world. Chen-Shi thought about it for a long time but could not figure it out. In the end, he could only put this question to the back of his mind. He planned to confirm it after Tiangang woke up. In short, it did not matter if it was 8 times or 100 times. This time, he had really found a treasure. After confirming the use of the main hall and the soul crystal, Chen-Shi immediately set up a restriction in the temporary laboratory. As soon as someone woke up, he would know immediately. After that, Chen-Shi plunged into the main hall and began to use the soul crystal to heal the injuries to his soul. Because his soul was out of his body, he could not cultivate. Therefore, in his boredom, he could not help but let his imagination run wild. Starting tomorrow, after Ninian fell asleep, he could secretly bring Yingying here. Then, they could cultivate together as husband and wife and... Chapter 258. Morning, 6:27 a.m. When Chen-Shi sensed that someone had woken up in the laboratory through the restriction, he stopped cultivating for the night. Although only 4 hours had passed in the outside world, he had stayed in the hall for a full day and a half. Time and space were concepts that were both independent and interconnected. This was not the heavenly jade realm, but Earth. Other people only had 24 hours a day on Earth, and Chen-Shi was also on Earth. However, he could extend his day to nearly 200 hours through the hall. What did 200 hours mean? It was enough to turn a newbie who didn't even know how to loot a bag into a sly old fox who lay in the bushes and waited patiently for a delivery. This kind of miraculous effect that could be called a miracle naturally moved Chen-Shi, who had never been moved by external things. As for why the flow of time in the hall was different from the outside world, this question was too profound and was completely beyond the level of a soul formation cultivator. Therefore, Chen-Shi was at a loss at this moment. He couldn't figure it out. Although the hall was very mysterious, Chen-Shi vaguely felt a sense of anticipation in his heart. Perhaps, this hall, which involved the true meaning of time, was not only an excellent place for cultivation, but also a necessary step for him to take another step above the soul formation stage. The hall was too important for Chen-Shi. Therefore, when he left, Chen-Shi set up an illusion formation around the hall and hid the hall openly. From now on, this would be his secret base. For this, Chen-Shi had even made up a very believable story. If Wu Lian started an investigation, he would just have to say that it was all an illusion. The reason why Tiangang and the others were trapped in the hall for more than a month was because they were under an illusion and mistakenly thought that they had been trapped in the hall for more than a month. In reality, they had only slept for one night and had a very, very long dream. Since the hall and the formation were both dreams, then the Azure Dragon was also a product of the dream. From the beginning to the end, Chen-Shi only did one thing, and that was to wake them up from their dreams. As for why everyone had the same dream, it was because the illusion was affecting everyone. In addition, the reason why the team had lost members was because the illusion had misled these weak-willed members. It was like sleepwalking, causing them to leave the camp in an unconscious state and then completely disappear in the vast snowy mountains. This trip probably bodes ill rather than well. In short, being able to survive was all due to luck. Everything that everyone experienced was just a dream and illusion. It was a perfect explanation. At the same time, it was Chen Shi's white lie. After all, what was the point of Wu Yan sending so many people if even he couldn't figure it out? I'll fool him first, and he'll slowly investigate in the future. By the time Chen Shi returned to the laboratory, only the two neutralizing grandmasters were awake. When He Tiangang and the professors woke up, it was already 10:00 in the morning. Because he had almost been possessed by the Azure Dragon, He Tiangang's mental state was very bad after waking up. When Chen Shi saw this, he told him to rest well. Although Chen Shi's cultivation was very high, he wasn't an official member of the Wu Yan. Therefore, He Tiangang was actually the person in charge of this mission. After that, Chen Shi explained the lie he had made up in detail in front of everyone. When everyone finished listening to his explanation, they all had extremely shocked expressions on their faces. Such a realistic experience was actually just a dream. Although everyone felt that this matter was too strange, there was still time to prove it. Therefore, after digesting it, they could only reluctantly believe Chen Shi's words. This so-called dreamland was indeed a little too ridiculous for them. In fact, if they thought about it carefully, they could find many loopholes in Chen Shi's words. For example, how could they explain the smell of dirt on their bodies after not bathing for more than a month? Also, how could they explain the consumption of food over the past month? There were too many suspicious points. No one was an idiot. However, Chen Shi's words were reasonable and there was also time to prove it. Therefore, no matter how doubtful everyone was, they had to convince themselves to believe Chen Shi's words in the end. After all, they couldn't think of a better explanation. The team had inexplicably lost members. This was a serious matter. Therefore, even though He Tiangang still didn't understand the situation, he still honestly recorded everything in the mission log. Just like what Chen Shi said, it was already good enough that they survived. As for what exactly happened last night, this was obviously not a question he should be thinking about now. Because he was also a smart person. The snow had been blowing heavily all night. Now, it was finally sunny. He Tiangang had already seen the strangeness of the oasis. Therefore, the first thing he did after the weather cleared was to move the temporary laboratory to the edge of the oasis. It was about 200 meters away from the oasis on a glacier plain. At this moment, he would rather be in an environment of -50 degrees Celsius in the cold wind than easily get close to the oasis. As long as the professors finished collecting the data, He Tiangang could take everyone on a trip and leave. However, this process would take about 10 hours. Because of this, He Tiangang's heart was almost in his throat. He could only keep praying in his heart that nothing would go wrong. Unlike He Tiangang, who was on tenterhooks, Chen Shi was very calm. After patrolling the area with everyone, Chen Shi stuffed a stone into He Tiangang's hand. The spirit fog dissipated and the mysterious 5 elements formation also disappeared. Although the hall didn't disappear, the soul crystal, which was the core of the formation, was in his hands. The danger was gone, so Chen Shi was thinking, was it time for him to get off work and go home? It was almost noon. If Nian didn't see him when she woke up, would she cry to Ying? When he thought of the little girl's clingy look, Chen Shi suddenly became eager to go home. He couldn't wait to fly back to the little girl's side. After last night's experience, when He Tiangang saw Chen Shi handing over another stone, he didn't even wait for Chen Shi to speak. He Tiangang rushed to take the stone and smiled. I understand. Mr. Chen, go do your work. I'll throw the stone if there's anything. Hearing this, Chen Shi suddenly smiled. Saving his life was worth it. This He Tiangang was interesting. After talking with He Tiangang, Chen Shi left the Saikin Glacier. When he returned to Chengdu, it was already 1:00 in the afternoon. Chen Shi hid his body and landed in a secluded alley behind Wuhou Shrine Street. He had just walked out of the alley and looked up to see that the entrance of Aunt Zhang's neighborhood was crowded with people. A police car was parked by the side of the road. Many people surrounded the security booth and discussed. Looking at the situation, it seemed that something big had happened in the neighborhood. Although they were separated by a street, Chen Shi's ears were very sharp. Therefore, when he walked to the neighborhood, a conversation among the onlookers instantly made Qin frown. I heard that a child was kidnapped. What a big child. 4 or 5 years old. Is it a boy or a girl? Little girl, she looks so obedient. Oh, why don't those bastards get their retribution? Xiao Qiu is so wicked. He's probably been hit by a car and died on the road. Attention Lamake 666. Chapter 259. There was a child abducted in the community. A 4 or 5-year-old child, a little girl. When Qin heard this conversation, he couldn't help but frown deeply. Although he also knew that it was impossible for Nian to be abducted, as a father, Qin still subconsciously thought of Nian, so his heart was more or less a little nervous. There weren't many things in this world that could make him nervous. Nian's safety was obviously the first priority. But Nian couldn't have been abducted. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. Even if the earth exploded, it was impossible. This was because he put a lot of enchantment magic weapons on Nian. Once the enchantment was triggered, even if Qin was far away on the moon, he would immediately know. Moreover, with Qin Ruoying and Aunt Zhang's meticulousness, it was obviously impossible for them to let Nian run around alone, so they basically eliminated the possibility of Nian getting lost. However, even if he knew that this was impossible, Qin was still a little worried, so he subconsciously quickened his pace. In the blink of an eye, he had already arrived at the gate of the community. Auntie Zhang's neighborhood was an old-fashioned neighborhood that didn't even have elevators. Naturally, there wouldn't be any grand decorations at the entrance of such a neighborhood. Even the railings for parking fees were only built after cars became popular. There were many people gathered at the gate of the community, most of them were uncles and aunties above the age of 40. The family who lost the child lived in the building next to Aunt Zhang's. The child's parents had to work, so it was usually the grandparents who took care of the child. Now that the child was lost, the old couple could only sit on the ground and cry helplessly. The old couple was so sad that they couldn't speak, but the onlookers were talking one after another, giving the police who came to check the situation a headache. After all, losing a child attracted more attention than jumping off a building. There were only 3 surveillance cameras in the community, and one of them was at the gate. However, the resolution of these cameras wasn't high, and they were in black and white, so the images looked very blurry. After the police checked the surveillance footage based on the time when the child went missing, it took them a lot of effort to find the footage of the child leaving the neighborhood. The child ran out on her own, but she was following behind a woman riding an electric scooter. It seemed that she was willing. Human traffickers generally like to abduct children under the age of 5 because the children's minds were not fully developed yet. Naturally, they would not be vigilant and would be pleased with toys or candy. Speaking of human traffickers, it was actually an occupation with a long history. In ancient times, there was a saying that there were 3 religions and 9 classes. Human traffickers were one of the 9 classes. In ancient times, they were called demons of time. They did immoral things like abducting people. However, compared to modern times, human traffickers in ancient times were still too naive. After abducting women and children, they would only sell them for money. If the abducted women and children were lucky, they might even be sold to a rich family and live a better life than before. Now, in addition to human trafficking, human traffickers have also found a new way to sell organs. Abduct the child first, sell the organs, and then sell the child for money. If the child couldn't be sold, then break the child's arms and legs and let the child beg. If begging didn't work, then let them steal. What if they couldn't even steal? That was very simple. Throw them into the AIDS ward. If they tested positive for AIDS, they would be assigned to the AIDS team. In the future, they would be responsible for collecting debts. If there was a debt collector who didn't pay up, then they would think of ways to infect the debt collector. In short, they made the best use of everything, and their methods were beyond the imagination of ordinary people. It could be said that, utterly devoid of conscience. To the human traffickers, children were just valuable goods in their eyes. The big goods were boys, and the small goods were girls. Of course, there were only a few such large-scale human traffickers. Ordinary small fish and shrimps would not be so cruel. Nowadays, parents were aware of this, so they would teach their children not to talk to strangers from a young age. Under such circumstances, this woman was able to get the child to leave with her willingly. She was obviously a repeat offender. If she was caught, she would definitely be shot to death. It was just after the new year, and the human traffickers were already at work. Parents with children at home naturally felt afraid. Since one went missing, there was a possibility that a second one would go missing. Therefore, a few onlooking parents immediately used this opportunity to educate their children. Suddenly, the children were so scared that they started to cry. Outside the community was an old street, and there were no cameras. Therefore, the police had to carefully look through the entry and exit records for the entire day. After a long search, they finally found the woman's face. However, this woman had a certain level of anti-detection awareness. She was wearing an ordinary down jacket with a hood, and she even wore a hat. Therefore, the woman's face could not be seen clearly on the surveillance screen. Seeing this, the two police officers suddenly looked at each other helplessly. Well, this was probably another unsolved case. It wasn't that they didn't work hard, but they really couldn't do anything. As parents, they didn't look after their children and let their children be abducted by human traffickers. Even if they called the police in time, in this vast sea of people, where could the police find them? They could only walk through the streets and ask door to door. They would be thankful if they could get a little bit of useful information. After all, the human traffickers were not stupid. The kind of idiot who suddenly wanted to commit a crime because of a lack of money was always in the minority. The habitual criminals would definitely plan a retreat in advance. It was indeed difficult to catch. Chen Shi walked around the crowd into the community. From afar, he saw Aunt Zhang's family and Qin Ruoying, who was holding the little boy. The little boy was lying on Qin Ruoying's body, his two hands tightly wrapped around her neck. His little face was full of nervousness and timidity. Aunt Zhang probably took the opportunity to educate him. Chen Shi squeezed into the crowd and walked in their direction. The little boy stood high and could see far, so before he could get close, he had already seen his father in the crowd. He immediately shouted excitedly, "Papa! Papa!" Seeing this, Chen Shi immediately smiled and waved at him, then quickly walked to Qin Ruoying's side. When Chen Shi came over, the little boy immediately reached out his hands and motioned for Chen Shi to hold him. This action was very common, but the slightly different thing was that when the little boy saw his father this time, his cute little face did not show much of a smile. She was obviously frightened. Like a frightened ostrich, as soon as the little boy came into Chen Shi's arms, he immediately leaned his head on Chen Shi's shoulder. Chapter 260. The little girl was scared out of her wits because Auntie Zhang had just taught her a lesson by scaring her. Although the little girl was scared and seemed to be traumatized, Chen Shi didn't think there was anything wrong with Auntie Zhang's behavior. After all, if she didn't pay attention to education in this area, it would be too late for regrets when the child was taken away by human traffickers. Although that was basically impossible, setting an alarm bell in Nyanyan's heart in advance was always a precautionary measure. Human trafficking had always been the most serious topic of this era. Behind it was the dark side of civilized society. Why did human traffickers like to abduct children under the age of 5? It wasn't just because children were easy to deceive, but because children couldn't remember things. After 2 or 3 years, they basically didn't recognize their biological parents. Instead, they would treat the family that adopted them as their closest relatives. After many years, even if the child had a little bit of memory before they were abducted, it was usually just fragmented fragments and not enough for them to recall the complete experience. Ordinary people might feel that this kind of thing was far away from them, so whenever they saw news about it, they felt like they were listening to a book from heaven and had no interest in it at all. But all of this was actually close at hand. According to statistics, there were as many as 20,000 cases of human trafficking of women and children in the country in 2015, but the number of cases that were solved was only 3,000. The solving rate was only 17%, not even 20%. And behind these simple numbers, there were families that were shattered because of the loss of their children, as well as parents who were devastated. Human traffickers didn't need to be ruthless like the underworld, so they usually looked ordinary. They might be kind aunties passing by on the street corner, or they might be honest farmers. But under those seemingly harmless skins, there was a cold and cruel heart. Therefore, in Chen Shi's view, there were two kinds of behavior in this world that could be called heinous and could be directly shot once caught. And that was, drug dealers and human traffickers. The Western region had always been the disaster area of human trafficking cases. Although Chengdu had successfully become a new first-tier city in recent years, this kind of thing was still a common occurrence. Auntie Zhang's goal of educating the child had been achieved, so she waved her hand and asked everyone to go home. During this time, she pursed her lips and didn't say a single word. In fact, whether it was Aunt Zhang or the onlookers, they could only feel a deep sense of helplessness at the same time. This also caused the atmosphere at the entrance of the residential area to be very oppressive. The old couple who had lost their child sat on the ground and cried miserably. That pitiful look really made people feel sad. After all, they were all people with children. As long as they imagined that their child was lost, that feeling of despair and helplessness would immediately surge into their hearts. He truly felt the same way. The police quickly understood what had happened, so they wanted to invite the two elders back to the police station to start the investigation. But just as they were about to help the old couple leave, the old lady, whose tears had dried up from crying, suddenly staggered and covered her chest with her hands. Then, she suddenly fell on her back. This sudden turn of events was like a splash of water falling into a pot of oil, causing an uproar among the crowd. Call 120. Grandma Lu fainted. Does anyone know anything about medicine? Come and take a look. Big Sister Lu's heart is not good. Is it a heart attack? Her medicine? Quick, someone get the medicine from her house. Everyone, make way. She's having a heart attack, we need to maintain ventilation. Do any of you know where her house is? The patient's house should have a quick-acting heart rescue pill. Go and look for it. I know. I'll go get it. Masterly, give me the house key. Where's Big Sister Lu's medicine? I'll go get it for her. The police hurriedly performed cardiopulmonary resuscitation on the old man while yelling and assigning tasks to the onlookers. After hearing that there might be medicine in the old lady's house, a middle-aged man quickly squeezed to the old couple's side and asked the old man to give him the house key. However, the old man was already panicking. He trembled as he searched his body, but he couldn't find the house key after a while. It seemed like he had completely forgotten where he had put the key. Seeing that he couldn't find the key, the old man was anxious and scared. He cried on the spot. I can't find it, I can't find it. I don't know where I put the key. Seeing this, the middle-aged man turned around and ran. As he ran, he shouted, Come! Come with me and smash the door. After hearing the middle-aged man's words, the old man's face became even more sorrowful. He cried at the top of his lungs, You can't smash it open. My house has a burglar-proof door. The old man lived on the first floor, so the burglar-proof doors and windows were reinforced. He didn't expect that it would become his wife's death warrant. How could he not feel despair? An old man in his 60s or 70s was now like a child who couldn't find his home. He could only sit on the ground and cry helplessly. These heavy blows one after another had obviously caused the old man to completely collapse. Just as the scene was in chaos, a calm voice suddenly sounded from behind the police. Police comrade, I'm a doctor from Huaxi's cardiovascular department. Can you let me take a look at the situation? Hearing this, the police who were performing CPR on the old man was overjoyed. He immediately stood up and shouted, Come, doctor, come and take a look. This doctor who came like timely rain was obviously Chen Shi. Based on the old man's current situation, it should not be a simple heart attack. It should be a myocardial infarction caused by excessive stimulation. To explain it in professional terms, the old man's emotional agitation caused his blood pressure to rise sharply. The burden on the left ventricle was obviously increased, the secretion of catecholamines increased, the demand for oxygen and blood in the myocardium increased, and the coronary artery was obviously insufficient, resulting in myocardial infarction and sudden cardiac arrest. Myocardial infarction was an extremely dangerous state. It could be said to be half a step into the gates of hell. The golden time for rescue usually did not exceed 30 seconds. The 2 police officers present had only learned some simple first aid skills, so they could not see the seriousness of the problem at all. They did not even realize the old man's heart had stopped beating. She squatted beside the old man and pretended to pinch the old man's philtrum. Only then did he quietly release his true vitality. He used true vitality to inject oxygen into the old man's brain and wrapped the old man's heart with his true vitality. After that, she controlled his true vitality and began to slowly squeeze the old man's heart, forcibly simulating the state of the old man's normal heartbeat. Thump thump thump. Finally, Shi's efforts were not in vain. After about 2 minutes, the old man lying on the ground suddenly frowned and then coughed violently. Seeing this, the surrounding crowd suddenly burst into a burst of loud cheers. Chapter 261. Seeing that her father had saved someone, the expression on the little girl's face suddenly became triumphant. Everyone praised Shi loudly. After a few polite and modest words, Shi retreated to the back of the crowd with Ying and Ninian. His appearance was like a sudden ray of light in the darkness. Even if the old man was half a step into the gates of hell, Shi still managed to save the old man very smoothly. In the news, it was often seen that the old lady would suddenly die shortly after she had a dispute with others. A large part of the reason was that the old lady's heart was not good. If she was not careful and was stimulated, she could die of sudden cardiac death. The police were also frightened by the old lady's physical condition, so they did not dare to ask them to go back to the police station now. They could only wait for the ambulance to come and send the old lady to the hospital for a checkup. However, even though the old lady was lucky to survive, the first thing she did after waking up was to look at the crowd and cry, "Where is my granddaughter? Where is my granddaughter?" When the old man saw his wife's sad look, he could not help but feel sad. The old couple immediately hugged each other and cried bitterly. The old lady was so pitiful. This also made Qin Ruoying feel kind. So, she gently tugged at Shi's clothes and asked in a low voice, "Can you help them?" Shi turned his head and saw his wife's slightly expectant gaze. He could not help but nod. But then, he frowned slightly. After all, it was very troublesome to find a person in a vast sea of people. If it were not for his sister-in-law taking the initiative to come to him, Shi might not have found Qin Ruoying until now. So, he was also aware of the difficulties. However, this kind of thing happened in front of him. Seeing the old lady's pitiful appearance, Shi still felt a little sorry for her. So, he made up his mind to find their child for them. As for how to find her, he had to think about it carefully. So, Shi came to the security room and asked to see the surveillance video. Because he had just saved the old lady, the security guard's attitude towards him was very friendly. Almost as soon as Shi suggested his idea, the security guard began to retrieve the surveillance footage for him. "I saw that woman come in. She was riding a battery-powered scooter. She should be in her 40s or 50s, but it was just a glimpse, so I can't remember clearly. Do you have a picture of the child?" "Yes, this is a recent photo of the doll. Uncle Lee just showed this to the police. I saved a copy, and I'm going to put up a missing person notice on the door later." Shi looked at the child's photo carefully. After memorizing the child's appearance, he nodded and said to the security guard, "Okay, I'll go out and ask my friends to help me see if there are any clues about the child." After seeing the surveillance camera and the child's photo from the security guard, Shi returned to Qin Ruoying's side. When the little fellow heard that her father was going to help find someone, she immediately pulled a long face and cheered for Shi righteously, "Papa, you can do it. I'll wait for you at home." Well, this little thing now knows how to help others. However, finding someone was not as simple as what was shown in the movies. It was possible to hack into the Skynet system and then use a computer to scan and compare. Although this operation was feasible to a certain extent, the success rate was far lower than imagined. After all, as long as it was not an impulsive crime, the criminals would definitely check out the place in advance and try to avoid the surveillance cameras when committing the crime. They would also disguise themselves to a certain extent. Although Qinshi's divine sense had recovered a little, the range was still too small. The scanning radius of only more than 10 meters was not even as far as he could see directly with his eyes. Because the injury to his divine sense had not fully recovered, Qinshi could not use search spells such as bloodline tracking or divine sense searching. Now, it was really too difficult for him to find a child who had been abducted and sold in a city with an area of more than 800 square kilometers and a resident population of more than 10 million. However, although it was difficult, since he had promised Yingying that he would help the old lady, Qinshi would try his best to do it. He would just take it as accumulating good karma for himself. Although he could not directly find out the whereabouts of the human traffickers, Qinshi could use his own reasoning to find them. How to reason? It was actually very simple. First of all, the left turn out of the neighborhood was Wuho Temple Street, and the right turn was the alley where Qinshi had landed on his way back. After the human traffickers had deceived the child, it was impossible for them to run to the main street, so the alley without cameras was the only choice. The child was about the same age as Nian. At the age of 4, the child already had his own consciousness. Once the child found out that he had been deceived, he would definitely cry and make a fuss. Therefore, the human traffickers would not choose to leave Chengdu by bus or train. They must have their own means of transportation, and it was very likely that it was a cheap and affordable van or a second-hand car. Of course, if the human traffickers did not have a means of transportation, it would be easier. They would definitely temporarily put the child in a stronghold and then contact a car for transportation. Time was another key clue. From the time the child went missing until now, it had not been more than an hour. In just a short hour, a human trafficker who had successfully abducted a child would not dare to take the child through the streets and alleys and wander around the main streets of Chengdu. Therefore, the child was now either in a stronghold nearby, or in a van that was heading out of the city. Thinking of this, Qinshi immediately called Qin Shueqing. After briefly explaining the matter to his sister-in-law, Qin Shueqing immediately replied on the other end of the phone, "Yes, I will immediately arrange for people to set up surveillance checks on all the roads out of the city." Speaking of this, Qin Shueqing did not forget to remind him, "However, you better not have too much hope for this kind of fishing operation. It's okay, as long as you do your best." After asking his sister-in-law to help set up surveillance checks on the roads, Qinshi carefully searched the nearby slums. If the child was not in the van, then he must be nearby. However, when he was searching, Qinshi did not have any intention of asking people on the streets. The reason was very simple. Not everyone was like him. Even if a human trafficker passed by the shop owner with the child, the shop owner would not necessarily remember that he had seen such a person before. After all, in daily life, unless one was bored to death, who would deliberately remember the appearance of a passerby? Qinshi flew in the sky and carefully observed the environment of the streets below. In recent years, the buildings in Chengdu had been getting taller and taller, but there were still many slums that had not been renovated within the second ring road. Aunt Zhang's house was in an old neighborhood, so although there was a bustling Wuho temple outside the neighborhood, there was a large slum area that was waiting to be renovated behind it. The living conditions in the slums were poor, and the rent was low. Most of the people who lived here were foreigners who came to Chengdu to work. Qinshi flew slowly in the sky, and at the same time, he constantly observed the distribution of the nearby cameras. He could only rely on his intuition to find the child. After all, human traffickers were also a kind of head-killing business. It was not because of the law, but because once they were caught by the people, they could be beaten to death by angry people. Therefore, from the perspective of a human trafficker, they naturally had to hide in a secluded and safe place, and there were definitely not many cameras near that place. Qinshi studied for a while, then chose an old tube-shaped apartment, and then directly flew to the roof of the apartment. Then, he took out the soul crystal from his pocket. Chapter 262. The tube-shaped apartment was a unique product of the 70s and 80s. This kind of house was like a student dormitory today. There was a long corridor connecting many single rooms, each of which was about 10 square meters. The living environment in the tube-shaped apartment was very poor, and because it had been in disrepair for many years, most of it had become dangerous. The owners basically looked forward to urban renovation and demolition all day long. Since the living conditions were so bad, it was obvious that the rent was very cheap. Perhaps because the new year had just started, most of the migrant workers were still in their hometown and had not returned to the city to work, so there were not many residents in this tube-shaped apartment. Chen Shi sat cross-legged on the rooftop, then held the soul crystal in his hand. He wanted to use the soul crystal to expand the range of his divine sense, so that he could carefully search this shantytown. If he couldn't find it, then he could only put all his hopes on his sister-in-law. Although she was not his child, he had already promised to help the old man find his child, so Chen Shi naturally had to do his best. Therefore, after a simple adjustment, Chen Shi calmed his breath, then drove his divine sense into the soul crystal. The moment his divine sense entered the soul crystal, Chen Shi seemed to have become a dolphin, and began to spread his divine sense outward in a way similar to using sonar. What was divine sense? It was a way of perception that transcended the five senses, somewhat similar to the legendary sixth sense. Even if Chen Shi closed his eyes, with him as the center, everything within a radius of hundreds of meters was under his control. A world in a flower, a Bodhi in a leaf. Within the range of his divine sense, he could immediately detect the slightest movement of everything in the world. Even the tiny flies in the gutter, or the earthworms hidden in the soil, no matter how well they hid, could not escape Chen Shi's discerning eyes. This was divine sense. The tube-shaped apartment was a dormitory that the public institution had assigned to the employees in the past. There were a total of 3 buildings, covering an area of about 2,000 square meters. With the enhancement of the soul crystal, Chen Shi scanned the 3 buildings almost instantly. Good Lord, this scan is amazing. Chen Shi was now on the rooftop of Building 1, and there was actually a corpse hidden in the building below him. Why was it hidden? It was because the corpse was sealed with cement in the bathroom at the end of the corridor. The toilets and bathrooms in the apartment were all shared. The body was under the sink in the bathroom, sealed inside with cement and bricks. In addition to the corpses, there were also many drugs hidden in these 3 buildings. Presumably, there were many drug addicts living here. It had to be said that Chen Shi had found the right place. This place could be said to be filthy and filthy. It should be flattened with a cannonball. In addition to the corpses and drugs, in an inconspicuous room at the corner of the top floor of building number 3, Chen Shi found more than a dozen children who were hidden by the human traffickers. Among these children, the youngest should only be 1 or 2 years old, and the oldest should be 6 or 7 years old. In addition to the children, there was also a girl who was about 16 or 17 years old. It was obvious that these human traffickers had abducted humans as well as children. How long had it been since the Chinese New Year? Looking at the situation, these bastards must have made a fortune during the Chinese New Year. After all, according to the market price, the total value of these children and young girls added up to more than 700,000 yuan. According to the Central Guang Night News, according to different statistics, the number of missing children in Huaxia every year was about 200,000, and only 0.1% of them were found. If calculated according to the average market price, then this was really an industry with a production value of over 100 million yuan. The granddaughter of the old couple was called Ting Ting. Because Nian Nian had just come to Aunt Zhang's house, she had not played with Ting Ting yet. Ting Ting was among the children. Perhaps it was because she had just arrived, but she was in good spirits and was struggling particularly hard. The children were abducted, so the human traffickers naturally would not provide them with good food and drinks. In the eyes of the human traffickers, these children were valuable goods, so in addition to tying the children's hands and feet firmly with ropes, the human traffickers also used towels to gag their mouths. The children were lying on the ground crookedly. Even if they could not speak, they still kept making woo-woo sounds out of fear. Because they cried so hard, one of the children's eyes were so swollen that only a slit was left. This scene made Chen Shi very uncomfortable. After all, he also had children. If someone tied Nian Nian up and threw her on the ground like this, he really could not imagine what a father would do in a rage. Therefore, the moment he saw this scene, Chen Shi expressionlessly withdrew his divine sense, then got up and flew to building number 3. There was only one adult in the room, a woman in her 30s. The woman seemed to be in a good mood. At this moment, she was squatting next to the pitiful young girl, and holding the young girl's chin with one hand and taking photos with her phone with the other. Looking at this situation, she seemed to want to sell this young girl for a good price. She flew to the top of the room where the children were locked up, but he did not immediately act. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the rooftop. He was waiting for the woman's accomplice to come back. As a family, the most important thing was to be neat. She sat patiently on the rooftop. It was not until around 6:00 in the evening that the woman's accomplice came back one by one. When all the human traffickers gathered on the first floor to prepare for dinner, she realized that this human trafficking organization was much bigger than he thought. They rented this building, and it seemed that there were at least 20 to 30 people, men and women, old and young. Among them, the youngest should be around 20 years old. They should all be from the same village, earning money together and committing crimes together. They usually lived in this cheap tube-shaped building, and then they would wander around in groups of 3 to 5 in the name of working. Once they found a target, they would start to plan the operation. Some were responsible for scamming, some were responsible for robbing, and some were responsible for keeping watch, scouting, and logistics. Although they were small, they had all the essentials. Among these children, some were caught before the new year, but they did not choose to ship the goods during the new year. Instead, they chose to ship the goods after the new year. Moreover, when they shipped the goods, they divided them into several batches to avoid being caught by the police. They were very experienced in committing crimes. She was also very patient, and waited quietly for more than 3 hours. It was not until 10:00 in the evening when 8 or 9 people came back that he stood up and slowly stretched. It should be about time. Chapter 263. In order to avoid alerting the enemy, she could only wait silently on the rooftop. He sat cross-legged and looked up at the night sky of Chengdu. He felt that the tears of the children had seeped through the walls and soaked the floor. He looked at the group of people gathered under the apartment building. Under the light, they were not human at all, but evil spirits that wandered the dark side of society. Because they had been tied up for a long time, the parts of the children that were bound by the rope had begun to have edema. When she saw this scene, he could not help but feel sorry for these children. How old were these children? They were treated like livestock. How much damage would this cause to the children's young hearts? As a human being, at the very least, she did not see any kindness in these human traffickers. Many people always wondered why the human traffickers had their own families. They worked hard just to better take care of their families, but they still did such a heartless thing. In fact, the reason was very simple. In everyone's eyes, children were gifts given to them by God. But in the eyes of human traffickers, children were just goods that could be sold for money. Children were pure and beautiful, and every one of them was so cute. It was not an exaggeration to say that which child was not more likable than Nyan. For the parents of children, their children were obviously the most precious treasures in the world. In order to catch these bastards in one fell swoop, she waited for a long time, but he also let these poor children suffer for a few more hours of torture in vain. But fortunately, all of this should end. Like a phantom in the dark, Shi's figure suddenly disappeared from the rooftop. When he reappeared, he was already outside the door of the room on the top floor where the children were locked up. It was still the woman in her 30s who was guarding the children. And why was the man not allowed to guard the children? Obviously, it was because there was a little girl here. As a man, there were always times when he could not control himself. This little girl was going to be sold for money. If she was accidentally broken, who would be willing to spend money to buy her? Therefore, in human trafficking organizations, it was usually women who guarded the goods. The door was not locked, and the woman was sitting on a chair not far from the door. She was watching a TV series on her phone. The moment she pushed the door open, the woman heard the sound of the door opening. However, she seemed to be engrossed in watching, so she didn't even raise her head as she spoke in a rather difficult dialect. She didn't pay attention to her, but looked at the children sitting on the ground. It was probably because they were tired from crying that the children were already asleep. Only the little girl who heard the sound of Chen-shi opening the door immediately raised her head and looked outside vigilantly. There was only an old light bulb in the room. Under the dim light, the sudden appearance of a strange man made the girl shrink back in fear. The little girl's movements made a rustling sound. After hearing this sound, the woman in the room finally raised her head impatiently and directly shouted in Chen-shi's direction. She thought it was a pervert who wanted to take advantage of this little girl. This kind of thing happened more than once, so she didn't care at all, but she didn't expect that after looking up, she found that she didn't know the man in front of her at all. The woman was stunned. She was stunned for a second or two. Then, her eyes suddenly widened, and she was about to scream. But at the moment when she was about to scream, Chen-shi suddenly stretched out his arm, and the invisible true spirit suddenly clasped the woman's neck like an iron hoop. Want to call for help? The two were at least 2 meters apart. Chen-shi just grabbed in the air, and the woman was suddenly lifted from the chair by him like a chicken. The pressure on her neck made the woman almost suffocated, but she still opened her eyes and mouth, trying to make a sound. Seeing this, Chen-shi said calmly, "I'll help you." After the voice fell, Chen-shi gently waved his arm. The woman's body was like a marionette. Under the pull of an invisible force, she instantly broke the window and flew directly out of the 5th floor. Then the question came. How long would it take for an object to fall freely from the height of a 5-story building to fall to the ground? The answer was, with a muffled sound from downstairs, the entire apartment was alarmed. Like a sudden power outage in the student apartment, screams and footsteps suddenly came from downstairs. This scene happened in front of the little girl, but she stared with her red eyes, as if she didn't come back to her senses at all. Seeing her silly look, Chen-shi couldn't help but smile at her. Then he gently snapped his fingers. Go to sleep, you'll be fine when you wake up. Under the effect of the meditation spell, the little girl leaned weakly against the wall, and her consciousness became more and more blurred. She tried hard to remember the appearance of the man in front of her, but the strong sleepiness made her instantly fall asleep. After the little girl fell asleep, Chen-shi turned his head to look at the child in the room. After cutting all the ropes with his true essence, he turned and walked out of the room. 30 to 40 people ran wildly in the apartment, and the floor made a bang-bang sound as they stepped on it. Listening to the gradually approaching footsteps, Chen-shi sighed rather helplessly. It would be great if he could just slaughter all of these scumbags, but he couldn't do that. Because this kind of large-scale human trafficking organization had abducted and sold countless children, he couldn't kill all of these bastards for a moment of pleasure. He had to leave some alive for the police to find the children they had abducted before. After all, there were so many broken families who were still holding on to a glimmer of hope that they could find their children even if they had to use up all their wealth. What a pity, and just as Chen-shi stood in the corridor thinking about how to deal with these human traffickers, the fastest among them had already rushed in front of him with steel pipes and kitchen knives. Seeing this, Chen-shi's face couldn't help but darken, and he suddenly made a decision in his heart. In terms of probability, when an earthquake happened, there would always be a few lucky people in a building who would be able to survive. In that case, let God decide who would die and who would live. So, just as the few men were about to rush in front of Chen-shi fiercely stepped on the floor of the corridor. A huge force suddenly went from the roof to the foundation, and almost instantly shook the load-bearing walls of the entire building. Just like an earthquake, the entire building was like a building that had been crushed, and it quickly collapsed amidst the dust that filled the air. At the same time, Chen-shi used his true essence to wrap the little girl and the children. After putting the children on the street outside the apartment, Chen-shi called his sister-in-law's phone. The apartment collapsed, but the number of lucky survivors was beyond Chen-shi's imagination. This also made him sigh. These bastards' luck was actually so good. Did the heavens have eyes? So, when he ended the call with his sister-in-law, Chen-shi didn't forget to repeatedly remind her, death penalty, it must be the death penalty, remember, good will be rewarded with good, evil with evil. If there is no justice in heaven, I will. Chapter 264. The next morning. The whole family was sitting around the dining table, happily eating breakfast. At this moment, the morning news suddenly broadcasted a news flash. Last night, the Chengdu police cracked a huge case of baby trafficking. They arrested 37 suspects and rescued 16 babies. The reporter has called the person in charge of the case, but as the case is still under investigation, the specific details cannot be disclosed for the time being. Then, the TV screen cut to the Wuhan branch. Many parents were anxiously waiting outside the conference room. After receiving the police summons, the parents rushed into the conference room and began to frantically search for their children. Only 16 children were rescued, but there were hundreds of parents present. After all, the police didn't know which family these children belonged to. Therefore, they could only invite the parents who had recently lost their children to come over and hold such a family reunion. The old couple was quite lucky. The first thing they saw after entering was their granddaughter, Tingting. The two elders quickly walked to Tingting. When they saw the abrasions and edema on the child's body, the old couple could not help but cry on the spot. These were tears of joy, and at the same time, the joy of surviving a disaster. The old couple hugged their granddaughter and cried for a long time. After their emotions had calmed down, they went to the side and began to register under the guidance of the police. The image came to an abrupt end. The camera cut back to the live broadcast room. After a few simple comments, the host smiled and began to broadcast the next piece of news. News always reported the good news and not the bad news. And this reunion was no less than a second blow to the parents who had lost their children. It was fine if they found them, but what if they could not? As the saying goes, the greater the expectation, the greater the disappointment. They came to the reunion with unlimited expectations, but in the end, they could only watch as others found their children, while their own children were still nowhere to be found. How strong did one have to be able to endure such endless torment? Therefore, at the end of the reunion, it would always be filled with the cries of despair of the parents. Those who heard it would be sad and those who heard it would cry. Such a scene was naturally not suitable to appear in the news. As a bystander, Aunt Zhang, like most people, did not delve into the details. Therefore, when she saw the old couple find Tingting on TV, she couldn't help but laugh and say, "It's good that you found her, it's good that you found her." Speaking of this, Aunt Zhang did not forget to reach out and pat the little girl's head. Then, she pretended to be serious and said to her, "Nian Nian, if you don't listen to me in the future, Grandma will sell you to human traffickers." What do you think? Hearing Auntie Zhang's words, the little boy was frightened and immediately shook his head like a rattledrum. He pouted and said loudly, "No. You're not allowed to sell me." As it spoke, the little thing burrowed into Qin Ruoying's arms. Aunt Zhang couldn't help but laugh out loud at the silly look on his face. "Silly child, Grandma is just teasing you. You are so cute, how could Grandma be willing to sell you?" Qin Ruoying comforted her with a smile. Hearing this, the little fellow pouted and snorted, and then expressed its strong dissatisfaction. Children also have human rights. Breakfast ended in such a happy atmosphere. After Kai Shu-Qin and Xia Pinglin left for work, Aunt Zhang packed up and prepared to bring Chen Shi's family out to play. However, because she still had to take care of her granddaughter, Aunt Zhang was busy for a while and didn't finish packing. During this time, Chen Shi discussed with Qin Ruoying softly. The new year was over, so it was about time for them to leave. They couldn't always stay at Aunt Zhang's house and freeload on food and drinks, right? Therefore, after a brief discussion, Chen Shi brought up their plans to Auntie Zhang. After leaving Chengdu, they would go to Zhonghai for a few days to reminisce about the past before returning to Shangjing. After returning to Shangjing, they couldn't let the little girl play so carefree anymore. They had to find a kindergarten for her and let her become a preschool child. This time, she would study seriously in a big class, unlike the past where she would slack off. Therefore, Chen Shi and Qin Ruoying didn't discuss with the little girl at all and directly decided everything for her. Although Aunt Zhang was very reluctant, after hearing the detailed plan, she still agreed to it. However, they could leave, but they had to wait until the new year. Since Aunt Zhang had already said so, the husband and wife naturally couldn't go against her wishes, so they followed the old lady's wishes and stayed with her for a few more days until the Lantern Festival. After that, the family went out and prepared to take advantage of the last few days to play all over Chengdu. It had to be said that the internet era was indeed convenient for people's lives. After Chen-shi rented a shared car with his phone, he drove the family happily to Huanglongxi. Chengdu couldn't be compared to Shangjing. There were only a few scenic spots to play in, and Huanglongxi was a relatively good vacation spot in the surrounding area. However, since Chen-shi came back, he took the little girl to see 5 scenic spots. In addition, she lived in Hohai for a long time, so naturally, she had a certain immunity to this kind of retro old street and didn't have the slightest interest. Therefore, after wandering around aimlessly for a while, she clamored to find another place to play. Chen-shi had no choice but to drive her around. It wasn't until Qin Ruoying found out that there was a marine park nearby that the little girl's big eyes finally lit up again. The scale of this marine park wasn't large, but the little girl had never been to a place like this before. After all, there was no harm without comparison. This also made her very happy. Along the way, she pointed at the fish in the water tank and asked questions. Why is this fish so big? Why does this fish have feet? Why is this fish glowing? Her understanding of marine life was still limited. As long as it lived in the water, it was a fish. This trip was quite pleasant. Before leaving, Chen-shi bought the little girl a dolphin pillow, which made her smile from ear to ear. Out of the aquarium, there was a shopping mall not far away. When the little girl held Qin Ruoying's hand and waited outside for Chen-shi to drive out, she suddenly noticed the shared bicycle next to them. Shared bicycle, she still didn't know how to ride a bicycle. Hohai's streets were small, so it was rare to see shared bicycles riding here. Now that she suddenly saw so many shared bicycles, it immediately made the little girl envious. Mama, I want to ride this. Looking at everyone riding the shared bicycle, the little girl pouted on the spot and acted coquettishly. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying said to her with an awkward face, "No, you're still young. You can't ride this. This is not for children to ride. I want to ride this. I want to ride this." Seeing that Qin Ruoying didn't agree, the little girl immediately withdrew her hands and ran to one of the bicycles. After Chen-shi drove the car out of the parking lot, the mother and daughter were still whispering, discussing, next to the shared bicycle. Chapter 265. Chen-shi drove the car out of the parking lot. Just as he turned the corner, he saw the mother and daughter who were discussing. The wife was dignified, elegant, and charming. The daughter was innocent, lively, and cute. For a father, this scene might be the most beautiful scene in the world. Qin Ruoying didn't notice that Chen-shi had already driven the car out. She was still trying to persuade the little guy to give up riding the bicycle. However, the little guy was now completely carried away. He didn't listen to his mother's words as usual. Seeing that his mother didn't help him, the little guy ran to find a small yellow bicycle, and then stood aside thinking about how he should sit on it. The yellow bicycle was the shortest bike in the shared bicycle, but even if the saddle was the shortest, it wasn't something a 5-year-old child could play with. Looking at the pedestrians coming and going on the shared bicycle, the little guy directly sat on the horizontal tube in the middle of the yellow bicycle. Then he raised his hands and tightly grabbed the handles on both sides. In fact, it wasn't right to say that it was a horizontal tube, because the yellow bicycle was a low-span bicycle. This kind of shape was generally configured for women's bicycles, and women's bicycles naturally couldn't have a large horizontal bar like the old bicycle, so even a child of a few years old could easily ride it. Of course, the premise was that the child could ride a bicycle. After the little guy strained his legs over the horizontal tube, he sat on the horizontal tube, and then used his 2 short legs to step on the ground and tried to move the bicycle. Not to mention that the bicycle wasn't unlocked. Even if the lock was unlocked, whether the little guy could hold on and not let the bicycle fall was a problem. So for a child, the shared bicycle really wasn't a toy, but was very likely to be a weapon. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying could only sigh deeply, and then the expression on her face became serious for the first time. It seemed that he was going to flip out. She was also forced to have no choice. After all, in front of the child, one had to play the good cop, and the other had to play the bad cop, right? Chen-shi spoiled the little guy so much, so the annoying thing of playing the bad cop was not only done by her. Qin Ruoying, who had always been dignified and elegant, was now going to flip out at the child on the street. Presumably, this was one of the compulsory lessons for the goddess after she became a married woman. However, just when Qin Ruoying was about to flip out, a horn suddenly sounded from the street next to them. Qin Ruoying looked back and saw that she had already driven to their side. After seeing Qin Ruoying's helpless expression, she immediately understood what had just happened. So, he quickly rolled down the window, and then shouted at the little guy who was still trying to ride, "Nian Nian, do you want to go to heaven?" After hearing his father's call, the little thing immediately looked up at Shi and grinned, "Papa. This is fun. I want to ride." As she spoke, she twisted the bell on the bike, but the more she twisted it, the more energetic she became. At this time, Aunt Zhang, who was sitting in the back, could not stand it anymore, so she said to Shi, "Why aren't you going to carry her back? Look at how you've spoiled her." Shi was inexplicably scolded, and he did not know whether to laugh or cry. Just when Shi opened the door and got off, Aunt Zhang did not forget to remind him, "Be careful, don't let her fall." It could be seen that Grandma really had a sharp tongue but a soft heart for her granddaughter. After giving Qin Ruoying a look, Shi quietly went behind the little guy, and then, when she was not paying attention, he lifted her up by her armpits. If it was in the past, the little guy would be overjoyed to be ambushed by her father, but today, she might be relying on this shared bike. Therefore, when she realized that she was being carried away by her father, the little guy burst into tears on the spot. Before Papa and Mama got angry, the little guy was the first to flip out. The sudden crying almost scared Shi, so he quickly touched the back of her head and comforted her, "Woo-woo. Nian, don't cry, don't cry. You're so young, so you can't ride a shared bike. Papa will ride with you in the future, okay?" Hearing this, the little guy cried even louder. What should they do? The couple could not help but look at each other, and neither of them hardened their hearts to play the role of the good cop. At this time, it was natural for the elderly to step in. Aunt Zhang asked Shi to put the little guy in the back, then she quietly communicated with the little guy. "Don't cry, if you cry again, I'll sell you to human traffickers. Nian, look at you now, you're not likable anymore. Do you still remember what you told Grandma before? Isn't our Nian the most obedient and sensible? Be good, you have to listen to Papa and Mama. If you make Papa and Mama angry again, be careful that they throw you away again. Then you can only live with Grandma in the future." "What? You don't want to live with Grandma?" "Io, Grandma is so sad, my granddaughter doesn't want me anymore. After all, she was a child that the elderly had personally raised." After a round of threats and temptations, Aunt Zhang managed to divert the little guy's attention to other places. The little guy did not even wipe his tears before he took the initiative to hug Aunt Zhang and said softly, "I want Grandma. Grandma is the best. The older, the wiser." Actually, it was possible to scare the child, but one must not use it as a tactic. After scaring the child to make him realize that he was wrong, it was necessary to divert the child's attention in time and let them temporarily forget what was in front of them. Otherwise, it was very likely that overdoing it would be as bad as not doing enough. If it was more serious, it could even cause a certain degree of psychological trauma to the child. Aunt Zhang educated the little guy in a low voice, but her words were passed to the couple's ears without missing a word. The couple sat in the front row. At some point, Shi's hand was no longer on the gear lever, but stretched out to the front passenger seat. The two silently felt the warmth from each other's palms. When the little guy's laughter sounded again, Qin Ruoying smiled and patted Shi's hand away, then pointed to the road ahead and said with a smile, "Drive carefully." "Okay, yes, Ma, am." The car was quiet, so Shi turned on the radio. Maybe it was set up by the previous tenant, so when it was turned on, it was the traffic radio channel. Pleasant music suddenly sounded in the car. This song could be considered a familiar Cantonese song. After listening to a sentence, Shi could not help but hum along with the radio. The little guy seemed to have completely forgotten the previous unhappiness, so when she heard Shi sing, she immediately laughed and clapped her hands. "Papa sings well. It's so good. How good is it? It's better than him. Little mouth is so sweet. Come, give Papa a MUA. What are you doing? You're driving. Pay attention to the road. For a moment, the car was full of the family's laughter. Hard to leave, hard to leave. I want to hold on tight. The vast life is like the wilderness, like a child can lean on his father's shoulder who wants to get off the car. There are always some things that are hard to leave. Common sense is so inescapable. No matter how cold the world is. Thinking of this bicycle, there is still happiness to be borrowed. Chapter 266. In the blink of an eye, it was March 2nd. It was the 15th day of the first lunar month, the Lantern Festival. The little girl did not like to watch the gala performances on TV, so the family went out together after dinner. Where were they going? Of course, they were going to enjoy the lanterns. The Lantern Festival began more than 2,000 years ago in the Han Dynasty and had always been a major festival in Huaxia. According to the ancient customs, the new year was only truly over after the Lantern Festival. However, the pace of life was getting faster and faster. Even though the legal holiday stipulated that people would only go to work on the 7th day, many private enterprises still required people to start work on the 5th day. Among them, there were even more, such as the catering and entertainment industry. They might open for business on the eve of the new year, so the employees naturally could not rest. Such a pace of life directly led to the Lantern Festival almost following in the footsteps of the Dragon Boat Festival. With the decline of the Lantern Festival, the lively scene described by Xian Qiji in Green Jade Case, Yuan Shi, was naturally no longer as lively as before. The east wind blossoms 1,000 trees, blowing down the stars like rain. The fragrance of precious horses and carts fills the road, the sound of feng shao moves, the light of a pot turns, fish and dragons dance in the night. Moths flutter in the wind, inging and laughing in the wind. He searched for her thousands of times in the crowd, but when he looked back, she was at the fire. Today was Friday. Although the public institutions were on holiday, most private enterprises still had to work tomorrow. In addition, everyone might be tired of playing during the new year, so the Wuhou Temple Street was not as lively as it was during the Spring Festival. After leaving the house, the family took a taxi and went straight to the Panda Lantern Festival. The moon on the 15th was full and round, but what was more dazzling than the moon was the colorful Lantern Festival. Because they set off late, by the time Chen Shi and the rest arrived at the Lantern Festival, it was already a 10-mile-long street with brilliant lights. As soon as they got out of the car, the fragrance of magnolia drifted to the tip of everyone's nose in the breeze. The little girl sniffed the fragrance in the air and turned her head to see the entrance of the Lantern Festival. There were a few panda lanterns outside the Lantern Festival. Although they were ugly and cute, they made her shout excitedly. "Papa, look! Panda! Panda!" In fact, to this little girl, there was not much difference between going to the Lantern Festival and going to the zoo. She was dazzled by the colorful lanterns in all kinds of shapes and sizes. She chattered excitedly all the way. In Chen Shi's eyes, this Lantern Festival was somewhat similar to the Earth Temple Fair. Other than strolling around, there was only eating, drinking, and playing. However, what was worth praising was that the food in Chengdu was indeed much better than the food in Shangjing. The whole family ate and watched along the way. After admiring the lanterns, they watched the magic show. Finally, under the illumination of the fireworks, they sat in the car and went home with satisfaction. In the end, this trip to Chengdu was still very pleasant. The next morning, after breakfast, Chen Shi pulled the little girl to his side and asked with a smile, "Nian Nian, Daddy has already bought the plane tickets. We'll fly back to Zhonghai later and visit our old home, okay?" "All right." The little thing's eyes lit up at the mention of taking a plane. Seeing this, Chen Shi struck while the iron was hot and said, "Then go and help your mother pack her things now. After she is done, we will set off." "Good. I'll go help Mama." Everything went smoothly. It wasn't until Chen Shi changed the boarding pass and took her to say goodbye to Aunt Zhang that the little thing suddenly froze in place. After staring blankly for a long while, she suddenly came back to her senses. Was she going to say goodbye to her grandmother? She thought Aunt Zhang was going to go home with them. When She saw that the little girl's expression was a little strange, he immediately smiled and hugged her in his arms. He gently comforted her and said, "Nian Nian, we should get on the plane. Hurry and say goodbye to your grandmother. We'll come to Chengdu to see her again in the future." Perhaps it was because this period of time together had aroused her dependence on Aunt Zhang, so when the little girl came back to her senses, she immediately said very angrily, "No. I'm not going. I want to go with my grandmother." This expression of anger rarely appeared on the little girl's face, so when She saw her expression, he was quite surprised. The little girl was angry and twisted her body to get out of his arms. Seeing this, She immediately hugged her tightly and didn't let her run away. But this hug was serious. After realizing that her freedom of life was restricted by her father, the little thing flipped out on the spot. "I'm not going. I'm not going. I want to go with my grandmother. My grandmother wants to go with us." As she shouted, her voice started to sound like she was about to cry. Following that, she burst into tears. Well, things were getting out of hand. The reason why the couple didn't tell the little girl in advance was that they were afraid that she would cry. But what would come, and they couldn't avoid it even if they wanted to. The reason why they wanted to leave was actually because of the same reason. Aunt Zhang had her own family, and their family was always outsiders. Naturally, they couldn't stay at Aunt Zhang's house for a long time. After all good things must come to an end. There were people coming and going at the ticket gate, and the little girl's sudden crying attracted a lot of attention. She had no choice but to take the little girl to a rest chair and let Aunt Zhang comfort her. This kind of thing had happened many times. It was normal for children to be clingy. So, the family comforted the little girl one by one. She took out his phone and made a live video call with Aunt Zhang. He promised that he would bring her to Chengdu in the future, and only then did the little girl slowly stop crying. But she still didn't want to be separated from Aunt Zhang. She lay in her grandmother's arms without saying a word, as if she had been wronged. In the end, even the airport broadcast announced that they were boarding the plane. Only then did the little girl reluctantly wave goodbye to her grandmother with red eyes. "Grandmother, grandmother. We'll come to see you in the future." After watching the couple carrying the little girl gradually disappear into the distance, Aunt Zhang couldn't help but wipe the tears from the corners of her eyes. Although she wasn't her biological child, her love for Nian Nian was very real. The plane took off. Perhaps it was because she had just cried, but the little girl didn't even have the interest to look at the clouds outside. She fell into a deep sleep. When she woke up again, the family had already returned to Zhonghai. The moment the cabin door opened, a salty sea breeze unique to coastal cities blew in. Unlike Chengdu and Shangjing, Zhonghai gave Shi the most unique feeling. But that feeling didn't come from the city itself, but from the people standing next to him at this moment. Shi carried the little girl. The moment he walked out of the gangway, he couldn't help but hold Qin Ruoying's hand. Zhonghai. We're back. Chapter 267. As soon as the family got off the plane and walked into the terminal, it began to drizzle. Just a moment ago, the sky was clear, but now it suddenly became drizzling. And this sudden spring rain seemed to be a ceremony to welcome the return of their family. Perhaps it was because she had slept on the plane, so when the little guy got off the plane, his lively and energetic appearance came back. Therefore, the little thing did not ask Shi to hold her. Instead, she jumped and ran in the corridor with her short legs. Seeing her excited look, the couple quickly followed behind her, hand in hand. If they ignored the little girl in front of them, the two of them now looked like a couple who came to Zhonghai for their honeymoon. It was impossible to tell that they were an old couple with a 5-year-old child. The little girl ran and jumped. After running for a while, she made a sharp turn and directly lay in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of the terminal. Then, she looked at the planes in front of her and said excitedly, "Papa, look. That plane is running." She came to the little girl's side. After touching her head with a smile, he put his hand on her back and pushed her out step by step. While walking, She asked with a smile, "See, didn't you just get on the plane? How do you feel?" The little thing seemed to like being pushed by her father, so she leaned back and did not fall down because of the support of Chen Shi's palm. Then, she lay on Chen Shi's palm. Then, under the push of Chen Shi, like a master, she slowly walked forward with her short legs. I like it. I like to fly. Looking at the bright smile on the little girl's face, Chen Shi could not help but look at Qin Ruoying and smile. This child is so likable. The airport was so big that it took more than 10 minutes to walk out of the station. Even though there was a sidewalk elevator, the little thing was still tired of standing, so she turned around and raised her hands to Chen Shi. Without needing her to say anything, Chen Shi immediately squatted down and then hugged her in his arms. The higher one stood, the further one could see. Therefore, when she sat in Chen Shi's arms, she pointed to exit 3 and asked in confusion, Papa, what are they doing? Chen Shi looked in the direction the little fellow was pointing and saw 2 rows of burly men in black suits standing in front of the gate of the number 3 exit. That murderous aura was like that of a gang welcoming their boss home at the entrance of a prison. He should be here to pick me up. What's that? Let me give you an example. Let's say you take a plane to Chengdu alone. Grandma is afraid that you won't be able to find your way, so she comes to the airport to pick you up in advance. This is called picking you up. Oh, the little fellow nodded as if she understood. Then, she asked doubtfully, then who's coming to pick us up today? We don't need anyone to pick us up because we're going home now, not to Grandma's. Hearing this, the little fellow pouted and seemed to want to ask something, but Chen Shi pinched her little face and decisively stopped this topic. Nowadays, stars like to pose for photos at the airport. As the fashion capital of Huaxia, there were stars coming to Zhonghai Airport to pose for photos every day. This also led to many fans waiting at the airport for a long time, just to take a photo with their favorite stars. At least 20 or 30 men in suits stood at the number 3 exit. There was a murderous aura there, which naturally made ordinary people dare not approach. Therefore, even though the other exits were about to be lined up, the number 3 exit was still a scene of sparrows. This abnormal situation also attracted the attention of a large number of professional fans. Although they did not dare to approach, they still carefully surrounded the number 3 exit with their mobile phones, wanting to see which big shot was coming. Chen Shi's family was not people who liked to join in the fun, so after getting off the escalator, Chen Shi and Qin Ruoying directly turned a corner and walked to the number 4 exit in front of them. At this moment, a voice suddenly sounded from behind them. Mr. Chen, you're back. Chen Shi looked back and saw Su Wei with an old face running toward him with great enthusiasm. Mr. Su, what are you doing? Hey, I just got off the plane and saw you, so I wanted to come over and say hello. After all, you're my savior. Oh, okay, I've said hello, you can go do your thing. After that, Chen Shi held the little fellow in one hand and Qin Ruoying in the other and prepared to leave. When Su Wei saw his posture, he suddenly became anxious, so he quickly ran to him and continued to say, Mr. Chen, you see, this is fate. You haven't called a taxi yet, right? Why don't you let me give you a ride? While speaking, Su Wei bowed to Chen Shi and made an inviting gesture. Chen Shi stopped, but he did not look at Su Wei. Instead, he turned his head and looked behind him. Ning Zhongguo was standing not far behind him. After going through thick and thin together, these 2 brothers had actually become sworn brothers. After Ning Zhongguo saw Chen Shi turn around, he immediately ran over, then smiled at Chen Shi and said, Mr. Chen, long time no see. Chen Shi did not speak. Ning Zhongguo and Su Wei looked at each other quietly. Then, Ning Zhongguo reluctantly continued to smile and said, I came to pick up old Su, but I didn't expect to meet you here. If it's convenient, why don't we give you a ride? What do you think? Chen Shi looked at the 2 of them calmly, then turned his head to look at Qin Ruoying. When he saw Qin Ruoying nod gently, Chen Shi replied, Okay, let's go. I'll give you a ride today. That's great. Mr. Chen, this way please. Su Wei jumped up excitedly on the spot. He stretched out his left hand and bowed slightly at the same time, like a greeter welcoming an important guest. He quickly walked in front to lead the way for Chen Shi. Wasn't the direction he was heading to exit 3? Su Wei led Qin Shi's family to exit 3. At this time, 2 rows of big men in suits immediately bent down and bowed to Qin Shi's family. At the same time, they shouted in unison, "Mr. Qin, hello." 20 to 30 big men in suits bowed in unison and shouted loudly. Almost instantly, they shocked the entire terminal and attracted the attention of the surrounding crowd. This scene, Qin Shi didn't need to think to know that Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei had found out through their friends that he was going to fly back to Zhonghai, so they deliberately arranged such a show. The crowd was excited. After all, this was even more grand than when a celebrity made an appearance. Countless professional fans took out their phones and were ready to take photos. However, after the big men in suits bowed, they turned around and looked at the surrounding crowd, then stepped forward to stop them from taking photos. Qin Shi frowned slightly, but he did not say anything. However, the little girl in his arms was excited. She was a child, so she always liked excitement. This kind of treatment really made her very excited, so she raised her small hand and waved to the surrounding crowd with a big laugh. Chapter 268. Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei were obviously treating them with the highest standards. Therefore, when Qin Shi and his family walked out of Terminal 3 with Su Wei, the little girl was immediately attracted by the yellow Bentley in front of her. "Papa, this car is so long." It was no wonder that she was surprised. After all, the common 3-compartment cars on the streets were generally about 4.3 meters long, but the Mulsanne Grand in front of her was different. The length of the limousine was 6.57 meters, which was 2 meters longer than the average car. It naturally gave people a very shocking feeling from the side. The luxury car was extraordinary, so its price was naturally not trivial. The price of 35 million yuan was as high as a mansion driving on the road. Su Wei bought this car to receive important guests. After buying it, he had only used it a few times. Today, when he learned that Qin Shi was going back to Zhonghai, he immediately took out this treasure to please him. Of course, the price of this car was secondary. Tens of millions was just a drizzle for a tycoon of this level. The most important thing was that this car was limited to only 12 in the world, and there was only one in the entire Huaxia. Even if you had money, you couldn't buy it. Naturally, the price would increase. In order to win Qin Shi's favor, Su Wei used all of his tricks. He almost hung a banner at the entrance of the airport parking lot that said, "Welcome Mr. Qin to Zhonghai." Su Wei had completely transformed into a concierge now. He respectfully opened the door for Qin Shi's family. After Qin Shi's family got in the car, he wanted to get in as well. However, at this time, Qin Shi, who was sitting in the car, glanced at him indifferently. Su Wei was very smart. He almost instantly understood what Qin Shi meant, so he quickly found a way out of this situation. He smiled and said, "Mr. Qin, I won't disturb you, I'll sit in the back." After that, he gave Ning Zhonghua a look, and he ran to the Mercedes-Benz S-Class in the back. Because Ning Zhonghua and Qin Shi knew each other earlier, compared to Su Wei, it was easier for Ning Zhonghua to talk to Qin Shi. However, there was an old saying, "Today is different from the past." After the two of them experienced a series of events, their attitude toward Qin Shi had naturally changed dramatically. It was a kind of respect from the bottom of their hearts, and it had nothing to do with age, experience, or social status. It was purely because Qin Shi was better than them. This alone was enough. With Ning Zhonghua's personality, he obviously wouldn't do something like this. However, after Su's suggestions, he finally nodded and agreed. After all, if he didn't agree, what should he do to continue to get closer to Qin? Beauty and money? Did Qin need? Therefore, sometimes, it was very meaningful to put down one's face to flatter in front of the leader. As for those elegant people who thought they were virtuous and looked down on flattery, they actually fell into a misconception. They always thought that flatterers were incompetent people. In fact, flattery was a sign of high EQ, and it was also a common trait of successful people. After Su Wei left, Ning Zhonghua sat directly in the front passenger seat. In this luxury car, there was actually a partition between the front seat and the back seat. The back seat was completely a separate space, which was commonly known as the boss cabin. This was an extended version, and the back seat could sit 4 people, so it used a 4-seat design. Chen Shi and Qin Ruoying sat side by side, and the little girl climbed between the 2 seats opposite them. She seemed to be very interested in the layout of the car. From time to time, she would open and close the small table on the seat. She was having a lot of fun. At this time, Ning Zhonghua lowered the partition in the car, turned around and asked Chen Shi with a smile, "Mr. Chen, do you want to go home first, or do you want to eat?" It was not even 1 o'clock in the afternoon, which was just the time for lunch. Su Wei and Ning Zhonghua spent so much effort just to treat Chen Shi's family to a meal. Hearing this, Chen Shi immediately turned his head and looked at Qin Ruoying. It was all up to his wife. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying first looked at the tall terminal through the window, then asked the little girl, "Nian Nian, are you hungry?" "I'm not hungry." The little girl was busy fiddling with the car refrigerator in the middle of the armrest, and she didn't even raise her head. After getting off the plane, she clamored for Chen Shi to buy her KFC. After eating a hamburger, she was naturally not hungry at all. Looking at the little girl who was tossing and turning in the opposite seat, Qin Ruoying thought for a moment, then suddenly smiled at Chen Shi and said, "It's still early. How about we go back to school?" "Back to school?" Chen Shi was stunned for a moment. He really didn't expect Qin Ruoying to want to go here after returning to Zhonghai. But after thinking about it, Chen Shi still understood Qin Ruoying's idea. So, he smiled and said to Ning Zhonghua, "President Ning, to Zhonghai University, sorry to trouble you." Perhaps because he was in a good mood, Chen Shi's pleasant appearance at the moment made Ning Zhonghua feel flattered. He quickly replied happily, "Okay, Mr. Chen, take a rest, we'll be there soon." Under the gray sky, a fleet of luxury cars drove from the airport to Zhonghai University. Because he didn't want to be too eye-catching, Chen Shi asked the fleet to stop on the street some distance away from the school gate. Then, he held the little girl in one hand and Qin Ruoying in the other, and the family of 3 slowly walked to the place that represented the beginning. Time flew by, and the years flew by. What a blissful year, fleeting past. Time did not leave any mark on the couple's faces. They were still young, except that they no longer had the innocence of their school days. Everything seemed to be the same as before. The little girl lay on Chen Shi's shoulder and looked around. Her cute little appearance immediately attracted a lot of envious eyes. Ignoring the astonished gazes of the bystanders, the family of 3 leisurely walked on the forest path. That tree, that lake, that pavilion, that building, it seemed to be the same as it was 10 years ago. They wandered aimlessly around their alma mater. It was not until they came to the playground that Chen Shi suddenly remembered the magnificent feat of covering the playground with roses. Chen Shi would always remember that scene. In the sea of roses, Qin Ruoying, dressed in white, was like a beautiful butterfly. Under everyone's astonished eyes, she flew directly into his arms. That should be the most glorious moment of his life, right? Perhaps sensing the sudden smile on Chen Shi's face, Qin Ruoying asked with a smile, "What's wrong? Did you think of something good?" Hearing this, Chen Shi immediately squeezed her hand and asked with a smile, "Isn't it all because of you? Is it? Isn't it? Are you blaming me? How is that possible? I can't wait to do it again, TSK, that feeling, it's great. Look at how happy you are." The couple sat in the stands and showed their affection unscrupulously while the little guy jumped around them. A football game was being held on the playground. The little guy imitated the other spectators and shouted cheers from time to time. He looked very excited. After sitting for a while, Chen Shi suddenly hugged Qin Ruoying's slender waist, then looked into her eyes and asked with a little confusion, "Ying, actually I have a question to ask you." "What's the question? Why did you like me in the first place?" After hearing what he said, Qin Ruoying was stunned on the spot. She could not help but ask, "Why do you ask that?" Hearing this, Chen Shi shook his head and sighed, "I don't think I'm good enough for you." Of course, this sentence was not referring to the current him, but to the past him. Therefore, Chen Shi had always been very puzzled. What kind of luck did he have to be favored by the goddess? Could it be, Qin Ruoying really had the ability to predict the future? Did she know that he had potential? Of course, Qin Ruoying did not have the ability to predict the future. Therefore, after hearing Chen Shi's words, she could not help but smile. After reaching out and touching Chen Shi's cheek, she said slightly mischievously, "Then you have to ask Yu Lao, why did he put my red string on your hand? Then I have to go to Yu Lao's temple and burn incense to repay the vow. I have to thank him for giving me such a good wife." Fate was a kind of fate. The reason why the two of them were together was perhaps because fate had arranged for them to be together. And Chen Shi obviously had not reached the level of being able to see through fate. You are as beautiful as a flower, and the years pass by like water. Answer is leisurely and self-pity in the boudoir. Turn in front of the peony fence, close to the lake and the mountain rock. Loosen the collar button with you, the width of the shirt, the tips of the sleeves are ruffled, and the teeth are stained. Wait for you to endure and sleep tenderly for a while. It was that place where they had met before. Look at each other, it was difficult to say anything to each other.